Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
A group of friends, 4 souls, each with their own ghosts, set out for what should have been a carefree winter getaway in the secluded mountains of Colorado. But what they would come to realize in the frigid, biting cold was that some places, no matter how beautiful, are meant to be left alone. It was a bitter Friday evening when I, Noah, and my girlfriend Mia met up with the others at the edge of the mountain road. The place was remote, far from any real signs of life. Avery, my childhood friend, and his girlfriend Grace were already there, their headlights casting long shadows on the snow-covered path. The cabin was more isolated than we'd imagined, sitting like a ghost among the towering trees. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in stories about things that go bump in the night. Avery's family had owned the cabin for years, but I had never been. I had heard the rumors, though, about the strange sounds in the woods, the flickering lights when the power was off, the long winters that dragged on endlessly with strange, unexplainable occurrences. But all of that was just old talk, right? Nothing more than drunk stories told around a campfire. We didn't think much of it as we unloaded the gear, excited for the snow and the adventure ahead. We had planned to stay for the weekend. No signal, no distractions, just the cold mountain air and time together. At least that's what we hoped for. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. No rustling of animals, no breeze through the branches. The snow clung heavily to the trees, and there was no sign of movement except the occasional drifts caused by the wind. "Let's get inside," Avery suggested. "I'll get the fire going." The warmth of the cabin was a relief as we walked in. The old wood floors creaked beneath our boots as we kicked off the snow and hung our coats by the door. The living room smelled of pine and old leather, with a stone fireplace at the center of it all. There was a large table with chairs, an assortment of board games stacked in the corner, and a collection of books that looked well-worn, like they'd been loved for generations. "First night's a celebration," Avery said, pouring a round of whiskey for everyone. Mia and Grace settled on the couch with blankets, while Avery and I checked out the firewood and stoked the flames. The wind howled outside, its cold fingers tapping at the windows as the shadows in the corner seemed to stretch and grow. As the evening wore on, we drank, laughed, and told stories. But as the hours passed, a strange unease crept in. It wasn't just the biting cold outside. Something seemed to whisper beneath the surface. The walls groaned. The floorboards creaked in ways that felt wrong. The air grew thicker with each passing minute, as though the house itself were breathing. "It's just the wind," Avery said, noticing the look on my face. "This old place has its quirks." Mia curled closer to me, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Grace, sitting across from us, also seemed tense, but neither of us spoke of it out loud. Later, we decided to soak away the chill in the hot tub out back, snow-covered woods. The steam rose into the cold air, and for a moment, it seemed like the world outside had vanished completely. I leaned back against the tub, eyes closed, the warmth of the water contrasting against the biting cold of the air. But when I opened my eyes, it had been before. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying in a way that didn't seem natural, and the snow that had been gently falling all evening had turned into a full-blown blizzard. I tried to shake off the unease. "It's just the storm," I muttered, but the hairs on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. We decided to call it a night, and as we trudged back inside, I caught a glimpse of something, or rather, someone, moving between the trees in the distance. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure of a person, but the snow was falling so heavily that it could have been a trick of the light. "You okay?" Mia asked, sensing my hesitation. "It's nothing." But the feeling didn't leave me. That night, we turned in early, exhausted from the cold and the physical exertion of the day. Avery and Grace took the room at the end of the hall, and Mia and I took the one next to it. The house creaked and groaned as the wind howled outside, and sleep was slow to come. It wasn't until the dead of night, long after I had drifted off, that I awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone moving around the cabin. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like someone walking very carefully. But then the footsteps grew louder. They were unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The storm outside had grown stronger, the wind battering the house with such force, it was as if the wilderness itself were trying to break in. I glanced over at Mia, who was still fast asleep, but the footsteps. They weren't in the hallway. They were coming from the stairs leading up to the attic. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The sound seemed to grow closer, stopping just outside the door. I wanted to call out, to tell Avery or Grace, but I couldn't bring myself to. There was a sense of overwhelming dread in the air now. Suddenly, the door handle began to turn. I barely had time to think before the door creaked open. A pale, sickly figure stepped inside. The eyes were hollow, dark, and lifeless, and the skin was stretched tight over sharp bones. But the thing, or whatever it was, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us from the doorway. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I felt paralyzed, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The figure didn't stay long. It seemed to vanish into the shadows of the room as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but the cold chill of its presence. I lay back down, pretending to be asleep, but I knew something was horribly wrong. I wanted to wake Mia, but I couldn't bring myself to. The next morning we all met in the living room, the atmosphere tense. Avery and Grace had heard nothing, but Mia and I were different. There was an unspoken understanding between us now, something we couldn't explain, only feel. "Let's go out for a walk," I suggested, trying to shake off the lingering dread. Clear our heads. Avery, always the adventurous one, agreed. We bundled up in warm clothes and headed out into the blizzard, the wind cutting through us like 1,000 icy knives. The woods were silent, unnaturally silent. Even the birds were absent. It wasn't long before I noticed the footprints. At first I thought they were ours, fresh impressions in the snow, but as we walked further, I realized they were leading us deeper into the forest. "I don't like this," Grace said, her voice shaking. "We need to go back." But something compelled me to keep going, and Avery agreed. The snow was falling heavier now, and the woods seemed to close in around us. The deeper we went, the more the eerie silence took hold. No animal sounds, no wind through the trees, just the crunch of our boots in the snow and the sound of our breathing. I was beginning to feel the weight of something unseen watching us, its eyes boring into the back of our necks. That's when we heard it again, the same moaning sound I had heard the night before, low, guttural, and full of sorrow. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the storm, it was something else. We turned to leave, but the moaning grew louder, more desperate. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, heart racing, but there was no one there, just the wind. But as we retraced our steps, we realized something more horrifying. There were new footprints now, more figures, moving behind us. In the distance, through the trees, I thought I saw them. Figures, their silhouettes barely visible in the thick fog. They moved quickly, as if they were hunting, following us. They were getting closer. We ran. I was 12. At that tender age where you're brave enough to start staying home alone, but still young enough to feel the weight of every creak and shadow in the house. My parents had only recently started leaving me by myself. They trusted me and I liked the independence. On this particular night, they were out at a dinner party, and I was home, tucked away in the basement, playing video games to pass the time. The basement was ours, a shared gaming haven for me and my older sister Ellie. My dad had insisted the video games stay down there, away from the living room. It was a spacious basement, but there was always something about it that unsettled me. Maybe it was the dim lighting, or the way the sound seemed to carry in strange, hollow echoes. As kids, Ellie and I would sprint up the stairs after turning off the lights, convinced something was chasing us. I'd like to say I'd outgrown that fear by 7th grade, but honestly, being alone down there still gave me chills. I glanced over my shoulder every so often just to reassure myself. I was lost in my game when suddenly, bang! The sound rattled the basement window behind me, and my heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around so fast I nearly knocked over my controller. The window was dark, the snow outside blanketing the ground and muffling everything in an eerie silence. At first I thought it might have been an icicle falling or a branch scraping the glass. Trying to shake it off, I turned back to my game. But then another loud bang jolted me. This time I stood up and approached the window, my heart hammering in my chest. There were small patches of snow on the glass, and it looked like someone had thrown a snowball. "Ellie?" I muttered to myself, thinking my sister had come home early to mess with me. I decided to check. Leaving the controller on the couch, I trudged upstairs, slipping on a pair of house shoes. The night air was biting cold as I stepped outside. The snow crunched loudly under my feet, and a gust of wind cut through my hoodie. The backyard was cloaked in shadows, the brick wall to the left blocking most of the view. "Ellie," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. But then I saw it. A figure crouched in the bushes near the back fence. They were motionless, their face obscured by a hood. "Ellie, cut it out," I said, though my voice faltered as doubt crept in. Something about the figure's posture wasn't right. It didn't feel like a playful sibling. It felt wrong. Fear overtook curiosity, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed the phone and called my mom. "Mom, is Ellie supposed to be home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, she's at a friend's house tonight. Why? Someone's outside. They're throwing snowballs at the windows." My mom's voice turned sharp. "Lock the doors. Don't let them know you're home." "It's too late," I stammered. "I already went outside." She put me on speaker so my dad could listen. They told me to go upstairs, lock myself in my room, and wait for them to get home. My mom said she'd call the police. I followed their instructions, retreating to my room and turning off the lights. I peeked through the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The figure was now pacing in the backyard, stopping occasionally to peer into the kitchen window. My stomach dropped as I realized they were trying to open it. It wasn't a kid. This person was tall, too tall to be a teenager. Their hood obscured their face, but I could tell from their movements that they were methodical, deliberate. When they turned and looked up at the second-story windows, I ducked down, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Moments later, a sharp crack rang out. My bedroom window shook violently. I froze, not daring to breathe. The snowballs had stopped, but now they were outside my room. I called my mom back, whispering into the phone, "They're at my window. The police are on their way," she assured me. "Just stay quiet." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the doorbell rang. Peering cautiously through the peephole, I saw a lone police officer, a woman in her 40s with a stern but kind expression. I let her in, and she immediately began searching the property. I watched from the safety of the house as she swept the yard with her flashlight, her boots crunching in the snow. She checked the bushes, the patio, even climbed up on the shed roof. When she came back inside, she looked concerned. "There are footprints all over the yard," she said, "but whoever it was, they're gone now." She stayed with me until my parents returned, reassuring me that it was likely just a prank or someone trying to scare me. But as much as I wanted to believe that, something about the way the figure moved, the way they targeted specific windows, didn't sit right. I never stayed home alone again after that night. I own 3 properties. 2 of them are rentals listed on Airbnb, and the third is my home in Montreal. I always thought my Wakefield rental, a quaint, secluded cabin deep in the woods, was a peaceful getaway. But after what happened that winter night, I can never think of it the same way. The Wakefield house is a small 2-bedroom cabin, perfect for couples or small groups. It's charming, isolated and quiet, the kind of place people come to escape the world. But sometimes, when you're that far from everything, the world finds you in ways you don't expect. That weekend, I drove up to the property after hosting a group of guests who had rented the place for a few days. Groups always made me nervous. They were unpredictable, often messy, and occasionally careless. My plan was to clean up, check for damages, and spend the night before heading back to Montreal. I always text my neighbor Isaac whenever I visit. He owns the house down the hill but rarely stays there. When I mentioned my visit, he quickly replied, asking if I could check his mailbox for a letter he'd been expecting. I stopped by his place before heading to the cabin. The driveway was buried in fresh snow and everything looked normal at first, until I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the woods, trailed across his yard, and led directly to the window near the side of the house. My stomach tightened as I followed them, my breath visible in the icy air. The tracks circled the house, stopped at the back door, then disappeared back into the forest. Isaac was nonchalant when I called to tell him. "As long as they didn't break in, I'm not worried," he said, but his tone had an edge to it. "The woods attract weirdos sometimes. Just keep your doors locked." I tried to brush it off as I continued to my cabin, but unease clung to me like a shadow. When I arrived, I immediately noticed more footprints. They circled the cabin, their chaotic paths weaving in and out of the trees. It had snowed the day before, which meant someone had been here recently. Very recently. I shook it off as paranoia. People wandered through the woods all the time, right? But as I stepped inside, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The cabin was a mess. The guests had left dirty dishes in the sink, beer cans scattered on the floor, and garbage overflowing in the bin. I distracted myself with cleaning, music blaring to drown out the eerie silence. But then, I heard it. A faint crunch of snow outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding. Turning off the music, I stood still, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I locked the front door, my hands trembling. My car was parked outside. Whoever was out there knew I was here. I didn't want to confront them, but fear pushed me to look. Grabbing a flashlight, I peeked out the window. Nothing, just snow falling in the growing darkness. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. I worked on my laptop, pretending everything was fine. But every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. By nightfall, the snowstorm had picked up again. It was peaceful at first, the soft sound of flakes against the windows. But then the footsteps returned. They were closer this time. I sat in my bedroom, the bat in my lap, staring at the door. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, like someone was deciding their next move. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something, but the silence was worse. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw on my coat, grabbed the bat, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, but I ignored it as I scanned the yard with my flashlight. The footprints started near the window air conditioning unit and led into the woods. But then, I noticed something else. Scratch marks on the AC unit, like someone had climbed it. I looked up. There were marks on the roof's edge. My stomach twisted as I realized they'd been on the roof, watching me. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. When the officer arrived, he confirmed what I feared. Someone had been on the roof, likely waiting for me to leave or fall asleep. But the most chilling moment came when we checked the woods together. The tracks didn't just vanish into the forest. They led to a cluster of trees where the snow had been disturbed, trampled in frantic circles. The officer's flashlight caught something hanging from one of the branches, an old dirty scarf. It wasn't mine. Could just be a drifter, the officer said, but his voice lacked conviction. He promised to patrol the area through the night. The next morning, I left Wakefield, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. I haven't stayed there since. Guests come and go. None of them report anything unusual. But I know better. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps circling the cabin, and every so often I wonder if they ever really left. The cold air of the nursing home's hallways seemed to bite through my uniform as I stepped into the dimly lit room. I wasn't sure if it was just the nervous energy of my first real night shift, or something more unsettling, but there was a heaviness in the air. That night, something lingered, an energy I couldn't explain. I had just begun my career as a certified nursing assistant when I first encountered the unknown. I remember that night vividly. It was the fourth night of my training, and I was on the graveyard shift, a shift that seemed to stretch on forever, wrapping the building in an eerie silence. My trainer, Amy, had warned me about the odd hours, how it could feel like you were the only living beings in the building. Little did I know that night, I would learn what true isolation felt like. It was just after 2 a.m. when the first death I'd ever witnessed occurred. A patient named Laura, an elderly woman whose family had said their goodbyes earlier in the evening, had finally passed. Amy, with her years of experience, calmly walked me through the process, explaining what we needed to do. She assured me that the deceased were nothing to fear. They were just people like us. But as she spoke those words, something felt off. We started by cleaning Laura's body, washing her as though she was still alive, brushing her hair and meticulously cleansing her skin with warm water and soap. The air in the room felt unnervingly still, as if time itself had come to a halt. Then, Amy instructed me to retrieve the body bag from the storage room at the end of the hallway. I didn't know it then, but that simple task would alter my perception of reality forever. I walked down the darkened hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting long, unsettling shadows along the walls. The place was empty, save for the distant sound of a television in one of the patient rooms. As I reached the storage room and opened the door, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the dimly lit room, was an elderly woman. She was dressed in a faded blue dress, with a white cloth tied under her chin and atop her head, just like the one we had just used to secure Laura's mouth. The woman's eyes were fixed on me, her expression blank, almost as if she was waiting. She handed me the body bag without a word, and I, in a daze, took it. The chill of her touch still lingers in my memory, but it was the eerie calmness of her presence that I couldn't shake. I walked back to Laura's room, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I did. When I returned to Amy, I didn't mention the woman. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to say anything. We finished our task in silence, preparing Laura for the morgue. Amy tied the same white cloth under Laura's chin, securing it tightly. I asked her about the cloth, wondering why it was necessary. Amy's explanation was simple. It kept the mouth closed. But my mind couldn't let go of the woman in the storage room. Who was she? Why did she look so familiar? The cloth she wore, the same one Amy had just tied to Laura's head, it all felt too strange, too much like déjà vu. When the morgue transporter arrived and took Laura's body away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Amy and I went to the break room for lunch, but I could hardly eat. I had to ask Amy about the woman I'd seen. My voice shook as I explained what happened, telling her about the woman in the storage room. Amy paused, a curious look crossing her face. Then with a laugh she explained, "Oh, you must have seen Sally." Sally. The name sent a shiver down my spine. Amy explained that Sally used to work the night shift as a CNA for nearly 30 years, until she was diagnosed with breast cancer. After battling the disease, Sally ended up in the very hospice care she had once worked for. She passed away 6 years ago. But Amy wasn't done. She said some of the night staff still saw Sally, in the parking lot or walking the darkened hallways. "Don't worry," Amy said with a reassuring smile. "She doesn't hurt anyone." The words echoed in my mind as I processed what she'd said. And then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, Amy added, "I was the one who took care of Sally when she passed. I even tied that cloth around her head just like I did for Laura." I sat there in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. The woman I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was Sally, the ghost of a CNA who had passed away long ago, still roaming the halls of the nursing home she had once called home. The following weeks became a blur of patients, night shifts, and that lingering sense of being watched. I would occasionally catch glimpses of her, Sally, out of the corner of my eye. A flash of blue in the hallway, a shadow lingering by the break room door. But each time, when I turned to look, she was gone. And though Amy assured me that Sally meant no harm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in the air had changed. The nursing home, once a place of routine and calm, had turned into something darker, something filled with the echoes of lives past. I'll never forget that night, the night I encountered Sally, because in that moment I understood. Some spirits don't leave. They stay, bound to the places they once worked, watching over the living, or perhaps waiting for something more. And I wonder, am I the next one who will stay behind? It was 3 a.m. when I heard her voice again, the same voice that had haunted me for weeks after she passed away. It called out to me, soft but desperate, "My, I'm hurting." I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Her voice had been a constant presence in the nursing home, but this time it was different. It was no longer the frail call of a patient who needed assistance. It was the voice of someone lost, trapped between worlds. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Mai, and I used to work as a certified nursing assistant at a small nursing home, a place where the veil between life and death is thin, so thin, in fact, that you could almost feel the breath of the departed lingering in the air. Many of us who work in these places experience strange and unexplainable things. It's not just the grief or the weariness that comes with tending to the elderly. It's something else, something you can't quite explain but feel deep in your bones. This particular nursing home had seen its fair share of deaths, but one patient in particular stayed with me long after she was gone. She was an elderly woman transferred from the hospital because of severe pressure ulcers on her buttocks. The wounds were so bad that the hospital had already filed a case with Adult Protective Services. They were looking into the family's neglect, the kind that comes from not properly caring for a bedridden person, the kind that results in the skin breaking down, becoming raw and infected, because the patient had been left to lie in urine and feces for days at a time. When the hospital admitted her, I could see the signs of neglect. I wasn't shocked, but it saddened me deeply. Her name was never clear to me. She was just Granny in my mind. Granny's family never visited much. When they did, it was always a brief stop, a quick goodbye. The woman was paralyzed on one side of her body from a stroke, and though she could feed herself with her right hand, she needed help with everything else. Changing clothes, bathing, cleaning up, and every time she needed something, she wouldn't press the red call button like most patients. "No," she called out to me instead, her voice shaking with desperation. "Mai, I'm hurting. Mai, come help me." It was always the same. Night after night, I'd help her. I'd turn her, clean her, dress her, anything to ease her discomfort. I'd always reassure her that she wasn't alone. But then, one day, the inevitable happened. Granny passed away. After only 7 months in our care, her body finally gave out. That night, her family came in droves to dress her in traditional funeral attire. They made sure she looked presentable, just like they always do. But none of them seemed to acknowledge how seldom they'd visited her during her final days. It was the Thursday after Granny's passing when something happened that I couldn't explain. It was 8:30 p.m., and my shift was nearly over. I had put all my patients to bed and was on my lunch break. But when I returned to check on my patients, I found them all sleeping soundly. The nurse at the station, her face pale, looked at me with wide eyes. "I swear I heard Granny calling for you," she said, her voice trembling. I brushed it off, thinking she was just tired, maybe imagining things. But the nurse wasn't joking. She showed me her arms, covered in goosebumps, and I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. "Don't worry about it," I told her. "We're used to hearing Granny's calls." But even as I spoke, I knew something wasn't right. That night, my shift ended at 11 p.m. I finished my report to the next CNA and left the building, walking to the parking lot. The nursing home sat near a large grape farm, and it was quiet. Too quiet. I was alone, my footsteps echoing in the cold night air. As I reached my car and began to unlock the door, I heard it. The voice, faint but unmistakable. I'm hurting. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart leaped into my throat, but I shook it off. I must have imagined it. It was the stress, the long hours. But then, I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation that started at the back of my neck and spread down my spine, as if ants were crawling all over me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. I rushed into my car, locking the door behind me, trying to shake off the fear clawing at my chest. But the entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still with me. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't want to scare them. But the next morning, my mother looked at me, her face pale and wide-eyed. "Both your father and I heard a woman's voice calling your name last night outside the house." That's when I told her. I told her about the voice in the parking lot, about how I had heard Granny's cry once more. My mother, always the believer in the supernatural, didn't hesitate. Maybe she didn't realize she had passed away. Maybe she's still lingering, following you home because the funeral hasn't happened yet. And that night, as strange as it was, I didn't hear anything. The house was quiet. It was as if Granny had finally moved on. The funeral was held that weekend, and with it, the lingering presence seemed to vanish. But even now, years later, I can't forget the feeling. The way Granny's voice called to me from the darkness. I know it's not just me who's felt it. Many of the nurses and doctors I worked with have their own stories. Long-term nursing homes are a last stop for many patients, but they also seem to be a place where the spirits of the departed sometimes linger, not quite ready to let go. As far as I know, these spirits never hurt anyone, but every now and then you can hear their cries, begging for help. The night was unusually quiet when I first heard the call light flicker on. At first I thought it was just another malfunction, a common nuisance in the nursing home. But as I walked down the dimly lit hallway, a chill ran down my spine. The room was empty, yet the call light in room 12 blared, insistent, demanding attention. Frank's room. Frank was dead. He had been rushed to the hospital hours ago after suddenly vomiting blood. One moment he was sitting out on the patio enjoying his usual cigarette. The next, he was fighting for his life. And now, he was gone. The paramedics had taken him away, and I had assumed the room would be quiet for the night. But that call light, blinking in the darkness, had a different story to tell. As I approached room 12, the air felt heavier, colder. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. The door creaked open, but there was no one inside. No Frank. Just the emptiness of a room once filled with the presence of someone who had lived there for years. His things were still in place, but there was no sign of life. I turned off the call light and walked back to the nurse's station, shaking my head. But then it happened again. The light blinked on, even though there was no one there. I told myself it was just a faulty wire, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling crawling up my neck. Lisa, the nurse on shift, was just as puzzled. "Who's in room 12?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. I made my way back to the room, fully expecting nothing. But when I opened the door, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation that someone was watching me. The room was as empty as before, but the light was still on, stubbornly blinking in the silence. I turned it off again and left, but it flickered back on. I returned. It went off, I walked away. It flickered again. This went on for what felt like forever until I couldn't ignore it any longer. "You go do it," I told one of the other CNAs. By now, Lisa had grown concerned. She picked up the phone and called the hospital, asking for an update on Frank's condition. The response made my stomach turn. Frank had died around 7:30 p.m. that evening, yet his light still flickered on. We couldn't explain it. No one could. And the strange occurrences didn't stop there. As the night wore on, the light continued to blink in room 12, calling to us in the dark like some unseen force was trying to make contact. But it wasn't until the third time that we couldn't ignore it any longer. I went into the room with Lisa, the nurse, both of us standing in the eerily silent room. "Frank," Lisa said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "you're no longer living here. Please go be with God. You don't belong here anymore." And just like that, the light went off. We both stood there for a long moment, breathless, unsure of what had just happened. But something had shifted in the air. We felt it. Whatever was lingering in that room, whether it was Frank's spirit or something else, had finally moved on, or so we thought. Even now, when I work late shifts, I hear whispers about the shadowy figure seen sitting outside in the dark, by the patio where Frank used to smoke. Sometimes staff members swear they see him, sitting motionless in the dark as if waiting for something, waiting for someone. It's the kind of thing that doesn't surprise me anymore. Nursing homes are often the last stop for many, and once someone lives there long enough, some of them don't seem to leave. Their bodies may be gone, but their presence lingers, haunting the halls, the rooms, even the dark corners of the patio. And sometimes it's not just the patients who stay. Sometimes it's the ones who cared for them too, left behind to watch, to listen, and to feel the chill that never really goes away. It was late, the nursing home quiet, and I was making my rounds. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above. I was about to check on the last patient of my shift when something strange caught my attention. I paused, standing in the hallway, frozen by a feeling I couldn't shake, a sensation like someone was watching me. I looked down the long corridor where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, "Help me." I turned around, heart pounding in my chest. No one was there, but I just knew it was him. The man I had cared for, the one who'd passed away 7 months ago. Let me start from the beginning. I work as a CNA in a facility that has 2 wings, one for short-term rehab, where patients come to recover and then go home, and the other, the long-term care wing. The long-term side is, for lack of a better word, a place where people go to wait out the end of their lives. It's a harsh truth, but it's one you learn to live with when you're working in this field. One patient in particular stood out. A 58-year-old man sent from the hospital after his family could no longer care for him at home. He had suffered a stroke, which left him paralyzed, unable to do anything for himself. His family tried, but with kids at school and his wife working, there was no one to help him. He often found himself lying in his own waste, helpless. His skin was raw, infected from the lack of care. His family made the hard decision to place him in the nursing facility, where he could be properly looked after. I took care of him during my shifts. He couldn't talk, could barely move, and had to be fed through a tube. It was heartbreaking. His wife visited almost every day, sitting by his side, and I remember her telling me the story of their daughter, C. She was attending university a couple of hours away and drove a beat-up old Honda Accord. On one scorching afternoon, the father went out to put oil in her car when the stroke hit him, taking him down in the driveway. His family had no idea. By the time they found him, it was too late. His body never recovered. His wife and daughter were devastated, of course. His daughter C was especially kind. She would visit him, bringing him books and talking to him, though he couldn't respond. It was clear how much she loved him. I spoke with her a few times, and she seemed like such a strong person, even in the face of such loss. A year later, the patient passed away from a severe blood infection. The wounds on his body, particularly on his backside, would get infected because of his lack of mobility. Bacteria entered his bloodstream, and eventually, it was too much for his body to fight off. He died in the hospital. His daughter C texted me the news. She was crying, grief pouring out through every word. It's not unusual to see patients pass in a nursing home. Death becomes a constant presence, a part of the job. But there was something about this man's death that lingered. 7 months later, on one quiet evening shift, I was finishing up my rounds when I heard it again. The whisper. Help me. This time I couldn't ignore it. I walked down the hallway toward his old room, room 12. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been when he'd lived there. I pushed it open, expecting the stillness of an empty room, but instead, I was met with an overwhelming sense of him. It felt like he was still there, watching me. I stood frozen, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd always known something wasn't quite right with that place. The long-term wing where death hangs in the air, where spirits linger, and where the echoes of the past refuse to fade. Sometimes the other staff would talk about hearing strange noises, seeing shadows move in empty rooms, or feeling cold spots when the heating was running fine. But this was different. The voice kept calling out in my mind, "Help me." The same words his family had said when he was still alive, helpless and in pain. But now, it wasn't just a memory. It was like he was still trapped in that moment, unable to leave. I told no one. I wasn't sure if it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the job, or something more sinister, but every time I went into that hallway I could feel it, the weight of something watching me. Things didn't stop there. I continued my work, but every time I entered room 12, the hairs on the back of my neck would rise. It was like he was still there, waiting for someone to listen, to help. And the worst part, sometimes, late at night, I'd hear his wife's voice echoing through the halls, as though she was still searching for him. I never spoke to C again after that day she texted me. I didn't want to tell her that the spirit of her father might still be there, still wandering the nursing home, still trapped in the place where his life ended. Would she believe me? Or would she think I was just another overworked CNA losing my mind? Maybe I imagined it all. But every night, when the shadows grow long and the air turns cold, I still hear the whispers, faint but clear. Help me. It's not easy working in a place like this, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, where the past clings to the walls, refusing to let go. But I've learned one thing: the spirits don't always leave. Sometimes they stay, and sometimes they're still waiting for help. It was a late, quiet night, and I was driving back home after visiting my boyfriend in a city hours away. The trip was always long, but tonight it felt different, uneasy. My boyfriend, who usually made the trip to see me, was stuck at home with car problems, so I drove alone. After dinner and a movie, I waved him goodbye, and with a sigh, I set off for the long drive back. But something was wrong. From the very start, my car felt sluggish, like it was fighting to keep moving. It sputtered, jerking as I stepped on the gas. The engine, which usually hummed quietly, now groaned in resistance. A cold shiver crept up my spine as the car struggled to gain speed, and with each press of the pedal, it barely responded. I thought I might make it home, but as I passed through a small cowboy town, my car gave one last violent shake before slowing to a crawl. Fear gripped me. The road stretched out before me, lonely and empty. My car was barely moving, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night terrified me. I pulled over to the side, hoping it was just a glitch. but when I turned off the engine, it refused to start again. I dialed my boyfriend, even though I knew he wouldn't be able to help. He was always the last to sleep, waiting for me to get home safely. He reassured me he'd come right away with his older brother, even though neither of them knew much about cars. I sat there in silence, wondering if I had enough gas or if something more sinister was happening. My thoughts raced as I tried to think logically, checking the temperature gauge to see if I had run out of coolant. I noticed headlights in the distance, 2 cars driving toward me. The moment they passed, I got out and opened the hood, shining my flashlight on the engine. To my surprise, the coolant level seemed fine, but something still felt off. I was about to get back in the car when I felt it, an icy chill. It was as if someone had just slid into the car beside me. The whole vehicle shuddered and I froze, terrified. I quickly stepped back, my heart racing, and shined the light through the window. Nothing. But then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it, a shadow just for a second, moving in the seat. My breath caught in my throat. My legs trembled as I backed away slowly, and just as I turned to run, the hood slammed shut by itself. The car shook again, violently. I didn't even think. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked all the doors. My hands shook as I inserted the key and twisted. To my shock, the car started right up. No sputtering, no hesitation, like nothing had ever happened. With my heart pounding, I drove away, almost desperate to put the incident behind me. After about 20 minutes, I pulled into a gas station and called my boyfriend to let him know I was fine. No need for him to come anymore. I reassured him I'd be home in about an hour. I thought I'd shaken off the fear, but it lingered in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I had a dream. It was so vivid. I was at work feeding an elderly patient when a man I used to care for appeared. He handed me a car key and said, "Your spark plugs are old and not working well. You need to change them." I took the key from him and then I woke up, heart racing, the dream fresh in my mind. I didn't think much of it, but later, when I mentioned the problem to my older sister's boyfriend, he said he'd take a look at the car. After a quick drive around the block, he diagnosed the issue. It was the spark plugs. He explained that the plugs were worn out and not sparking properly, which was causing the car to stall. I had never even heard of spark plugs, but when he fixed them, my car ran perfectly. I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a dream. The man I cared for, the one who had passed away, had come to me in my time of need. Was it just a coincidence? Or did he really reach out from the other side to help me? I'll never know for sure, but the thought of it brings me both comfort and dread. It was an experience I'll never forget. It all began with an ordinary yard sale, but little did I know that a simple detour would unravel into one of the most terrifying chapters of my life. I'm a 31-year-old insurance agent, and after a week spent drowning in endless claims and policy paperwork, my favorite escape is sifting through yard sales and thrift shops. There's something about the forgotten treasures that others discard, pieces with a history waiting to tell their story. But this time, the story found me. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I stumbled upon the sign. A hand-painted arrow pointed toward a modest house with a few items scattered across the driveway. The usual books, kitchen gadgets, and tools. Among the clutter, one item caught my eye, a red, rusted metal toolbox. It wasn't just a toolbox, it was a memory. It reminded me of my grandfather's garage, the scent of motor oil and sawdust clinging to the air. Nostalgia wrapped around me like a comforting old blanket. "How much for this?" I asked the grizzled man running the sale, holding up the weathered box. $10, he replied with a shrug. It felt like a bargain for a piece of the past. We exchanged a few words about old tools, and I drove home with my new treasure, unaware of the Pandora's box I had just opened. For a week, The toolbox sat untouched in my garage, waiting for me to clean it up. Then, one evening, everything changed. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, urgent sound that jolted me from my post-dinner haze. Standing on my porch was a wiry man, probably in his late 40s, with a face that seemed weathered by more than just time. His dark eyes bore into me, unblinking. "You bought a toolbox last week," he said, his voice rough, almost a growl. I hesitated. Yeah, why?" "It's mine," he replied, leaning closer. "Sold by mistake, I need it back." Something about him felt off. His presence was suffocating, his tone demanding. My instincts told me there was more to this than a simple mix-up. "Sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I bought it fair and square. If there's an issue, maybe you should talk to the guy who sold it." He didn't argue. Instead, he locked eyes with me, a promise of trouble in his gaze. "I'll be back." And he was. 2 days later, the pounding on my door woke me from a restless nap. Peering through the peephole, I saw his agitated face. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. "Open up!" he yelled, his fist hammering against the door. "Just give me the toolbox and I'll leave you alone." I stayed silent, my heart racing. His frustration boiled over and I heard the doorknob rattle. That's when fear turned into dread. I hadn't locked it. I bolted it just in time, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing louder than my racing thoughts. The visits didn't stop. Each time he was angrier, more desperate. He began showing up at odd hours, early morning, late at night, until one evening, his pounding escalated into shoving, as if he were trying to break down the door. That's when I finally called the police. The officers filed a report and advised me to stay cautious. Their words did little to ease my nerves. That night, as I stared at the toolbox in the dim light of my garage, I wondered why it mattered so much to him. Was it sentimental, or was it something more sinister? Curiosity won. I opened the box and carefully examined the tools. Then I noticed the false bottom. My hands trembled as I pried it open, revealing small plastic bags filled with white powder. My breath caught. Drugs. Now it all made sense. He wasn't after the toolbox. He was after his stash. The next morning, I turned the toolbox over to the police. The officer who took my statement commended my decision, but warned me to be vigilant. If this guy knows you have his stash, he might not give up easily. That warning haunted me. When I returned home that evening, the eerie feeling started before I even stepped out of my car. The porch light was off, casting the front of my house in unsettling darkness. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open, the lock shattered. My stomach churned as I called 911 and cautiously stepped inside. My living room was destroyed. Cushions thrown, shelves overturned, papers scattered like confetti. Every room was the same, ransacked, violated. As I moved toward the hallway, I heard footsteps. Then, the back door slammed. I rushed to the window in time to see two shadowy figures disappear into the night. The police arrived shortly after, but the damage was done. Those men had been searching for the stash, oblivious that it was no longer in my possession. The officers promised increased patrols and advised me to install new locks and cameras. Even after taking all precautions, the feeling of being watched never left. The paranoia crept into every corner of my life. A simple yard sale had turned my world upside down. What began as a nostalgic find ended in fear, a chilling reminder that some objects carry more than just memories. There's something unsettling about a mirror that doesn't just reflect you, it watches you. That's exactly how it felt the first time I saw that mirror, leaning against a house at a quiet cul-de-sac yard sale. Its gilded frame, weathered with age, seemed to hold secrets, the intricate carvings of vines and flowers almost alive in the dappled sunlight filtering through a massive oak tree. I didn't know it then, but that mirror would shatter my sense of normalcy and safety. It all started on an otherwise ordinary Saturday. Yard sales had always been my escape, a small joy in rummaging through forgotten relics, imagining the stories they carried. That day, I stumbled upon a sign that read, "Antiques and Vintage Finds." The collection was impressive: dusty books, ornate silverware, vintage cameras. But my eyes kept drifting back to that mirror. Its warped glass distorted the reflection of the world around it, giving everything a ghostly, surreal quality. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like the mirror was calling to me. As I ran my fingers over the frame, a man appeared, wiry, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Admiring the mirror?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of something. Unease, maybe. "Yes," I replied, almost mesmerized. "How much?" He hesitated, his hand resting on the frame like he was guarding it. "Are you sure it's what you're looking for? It's special." That pause, the way he said special, sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. "I'm sure," I insisted, offering a polite smile. Finally he relented, but not without another odd request. "Let me deliver it, it's heavy." His insistence felt unnecessary, even intrusive, but I didn't want to argue. Later that day, his old pickup truck rolled into my driveway. He carried the mirror inside himself, refusing my help, and placed it against the living room wall with a peculiar care. "It looks good here," he murmured, almost reverently, before lingering a moment too long, his eyes scanning my home like he was memorizing every detail. When he finally left, I locked the door behind him, feeling an inexplicable sense of relief. That evening, the mirror transformed the room. Its golden frame glowed in the soft lamplight, and for a while I admired how it brought the space to life. But as the night deepened, an uneasy feeling crept in. The mirror's warped reflection seemed to shift, as if it were watching me instead of the other way around. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of a long day, and went to bed. The next morning, something else caught my attention. A car. An old blue sedan was parked across the street, its windows darkly tinted. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor. But when the car was still there that afternoon, and then again that evening, unease settled in my chest. Peeking through the curtains, I finally made out the silhouette of a man inside. My heart dropped. It was him, the vendor from the yard sale. Why was he watching my house? Over the next few days, the sedan became a fixture, parked in the same spot for hours. By the fourth day, it moved closer, now right in front of my house. That evening, as I peeked out the window, I saw him staring directly at my living room. My stomach churned with dread. Summoning courage I didn't feel, I stepped outside to confront him. As soon as I approached, he started the car and drove off without a word, the sound of his tires on the pavement echoing like a warning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and the mirror, once a beautiful centerpiece, now felt oppressive. Its reflection seemed darker, its presence heavier. I moved it into the garage and covered it with an old sheet, desperate to put some distance between us. The next evening, the nightmare escalated. Headlights flooded my driveway, and I froze. The sedan was back, but this time the man stepped out. My breath caught as he started walking toward the house. Panic surged as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator as I locked every door and window. Through the curtains, I watched him pace the sidewalk, occasionally glancing up at my windows. He didn't try to enter, but his presence was enough to chill me to the bone. When the sound of sirens broke the silence, he bolted back to his car and sped off into the night. The police assured me they'd patrol the area, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every parked car became a potential threat. Every noise in the night felt sinister. I brought the mirror back into the house, hoping daylight might diminish its eerie grip. But its presence remained heavy, a constant reminder of the man who seemed tied to it. I never saw him again, but the memory lingers. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. If he was just an eccentric man fixated on me, or if something darker was at play. All I know is that the mirror still feels like it belongs to him, like a tether to something I can't fully understand. Sometimes the things we bring into our lives come with more than we bargained for. There's something inexplicably eerie about old technology. The flicker of a VHS tape rewinding, the static hiss before a movie begins. It's like a ghost of the past coming alive. On weekends, I often retreat into that analog comfort, diving into vintage tapes and consoles. It's a harmless hobby, a nostalgic escape. At least that's what I thought. Until I found it. It started innocently enough. A lazy Saturday morning, wandering through a neighbor's yard sale. The air was warm, the faint hum of cicadas filling the silence as I browsed through dusty boxes and mismatched trinkets. Then I saw it, a weathered cardboard box filled with VHS tapes. $5 for the lot. Nostalgic treasures like E.T., The Goonies, and Back to the Future stared back at me, promising a weekend of feel-good marathons. But nestled at the bottom of the pile, hidden beneath the familiar titles, was an unmarked black tape. Its label had been peeled off, leaving a faint sticky residue, as if someone had deliberately erased its identity. I didn't think much of it then. Curiosity got the better of me. What secrets could this forgotten relic hold? That night, the tape became the grand finale of my marathon. The familiar hum of static greeted me as the screen came to life. What followed seemed ordinary at first. A grainy home video of a family in their living room. A man, a woman, and 2 kids laughing and passing a bowl of popcorn. Their voices were muffled, their movements mundane. I smiled at the simplicity of it. But then something clawed at the edge of my mind, a sense of familiarity. The layout of the room, the wallpaper, the furniture. It felt too familiar. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. My heart stopped. It was my house. The unmistakable layout stared back at me. The couch against the far wall, the chipped mantel above the old fireplace, the small alcove where I kept my bookshelf. Even the faded floral wallpaper matched perfectly. But the video was decades old, long before I ever lived here. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps this was footage of a previous family, someone who had lived here before the elderly couple I'd bought the house from. But something felt off. The family on the tape didn't resemble the photos I'd seen during the house tour, and the way they moved, the way they looked. There was a tension in their laughter, a shadow of unease behind their smiles. The mood shifted. The children glanced nervously off camera, their mother pulling them closer. The father whispered something, his face taut with fear. The camera panned, revealing flickering shadows on the far wall. But they didn't belong to the family. They moved unnaturally, writhing as if alive. Then came the whispers, faint and unintelligible, growing louder as the family huddled together. The screen distorted, static crackling like a scream. And just before the picture cut out, I saw it. A shadow, tall, angular, and impossibly dark. It crossed the frame for a split second. It wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen. It felt like the absence of light, as if it had been carved out of the world itself. Desperate for answers, I asked an elderly neighbor about the house's history. Their response chilled me. Oh, that family. They left in a hurry, they said, avoiding my eyes. Didn't take much with them. House sat empty for years after. People said, their voice trailed off. Said what? I pressed. They shook their head. Something wasn't right with that place. Best not to dig too deep. The tape now sits boxed away in my attic, untouched. But the house hasn't let me forget. On quiet nights when the world is still, I hear it. The faint hum of whispers, just like on the tape. And every time I wonder, what if it never left? The chair sat by the bay window like it had always belonged there, its delicate carvings of vines and leaves catching the glow of the setting sun. It was beautiful, yes, but beautiful things can hide terrible secrets. When I first saw the vintage rocking chair at a yard sale, it seemed like a perfect find. The dark wood was worn but sturdy, etched with a craftsmanship you rarely see anymore. "How much?" I asked, tracing the intricate carvings with my fingertips. The woman running the sale didn't even look up. $20, she muttered, her voice curt and almost hurried. She didn't haggle or try to upsell me on its vintage charm. If anything, she seemed eager, desperate to get rid of it. "An antique?" I asked, trying to mask my excitement. Her answer was blunt. "It's old. Take it or leave it." Her dismissiveness should have raised a red flag, but I was too enchanted by the chair to notice. I handed her the money, loaded it into my car, and drove home, imagining how it would elevate my living room's ambience. By the end of the afternoon, it fit perfectly by the bay window. I draped a soft throw blanket over its back and admired how its dark wood seemed to glow in the fading light. That evening, I settled into the chair with a book and a steaming cup of tea. The wood creaked softly beneath me as I rocked, the motion comforting, almost hypnotic. By 11 p.m., I was in bed, the chair already a cherished addition to my home. But just as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft creaking, faint but rhythmic. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. The chair was rocking. I told myself it was just the wood settling or maybe a draft. Still, I couldn't shake the unease curling in my stomach. The creaking became a nightly ritual, sometimes soft, almost imperceptible, and other times louder, as though someone was pushing it with force. I avoided the living room after dark, but one morning I couldn't avoid the unsettling truth. The chair had moved. It was slight, angled just a few inches toward the window, but I knew I hadn't touched it. I lived alone. There was no one else who could have shifted it. Trying to rationalize the situation, I placed a piece of tape beneath one of its legs to mark its position. If it moved again, I'd know. That night, I woke to the loudest creaking yet. The sound was violent, as though the chair was rocking furiously. Heart pounding, I ran to the living room. The chair was rocking wildly on its own. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice trembling, and it did. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My eyes darted to the tape I'd placed earlier. The chair had shifted inches from its mark. From that moment, the chair wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was an unwelcome guest. The next evening brought something new, whispering. Low, unintelligible murmurs seeped from the living room. As I edged closer, the whispers grew louder, though the words remained just out of reach. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped. Panic gripped me. I called my friend Anna, desperate for someone to validate what I was experiencing. She arrived 20 minutes later, dismissive at first, until the chair began to creak. Her face went pale. "That's not normal," she whispered. The final straw came 2 nights later. Determined to prove to myself that fear wasn't controlling me, I decided to sleep in the living room. I woke around 3 in the morning to a deafening bang. The chair was slamming against the wall with each violent rock, as though something unseen was forcing it. The throw blanket slipped to the floor, and my instincts screamed for me to run. I grabbed my keys and fled, not stopping until I was in my car with the doors locked. The next morning I dragged the chair to the curb, hastily scribbling "free" on a piece of paper. By evening it was gone, but relief never came. The living room felt emptier, yet the air was heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something into my home, and that it wasn't entirely gone. Now, whenever I see vintage furniture, I hesitate. I can't help but wonder what history it carries, what lingers unseen beneath its charm. The rocking chair taught me one thing: some treasures come with a price you can't afford to pay. They say the open road holds endless adventures, but some journeys lead to places you're never meant to find. From the eerie silence of deserted highways to the chilling shadows lurking at remote pit stops. These are the stories of those who strayed too far and discovered nightmares they could never leave behind. Tonight, buckle up and hold on tight, because these road trips turn from thrill to terror. I was taking a long road trip last year for work. I do a lot of traveling for my job, but I will spare you the details of work and get to my story. I left the city I was staying in at about 4 p.m., and I knew it would be a late night of driving, and I probably wouldn't arrive at my hotel until around 2 in the morning. I drove for hours and hours. The roads were pretty crowded when I started, and by the end of my drive, they were very quiet. It got to be around 1 in the morning, and I was about an hour and a half from my destination. The roads were very clear, so that was nice, and I was feeling pretty good. I was kind of in the middle of nowhere at this point, and as I drove along, I noticed a car come into my rearview mirror. It seemed to be going pretty fast. I was in the right lane already, so I expected it to blow past me. It reached my car and then slowed down, so it was going around the same speed as me. I looked over to see it was an old beat-up car that appeared to be about 20 years old and had some duct tape over one of the windows. But when I looked at the driver, I saw that he was wearing a skeleton mask. He looked at me for a good second, and then he turned and sped forward. I shook my head and kept driving. He went past me and then turned into my lane in front of me and drove about 5 car lengths ahead of my car, but maintained that same speed. When I looked in my mirror again, I saw more cars approaching. They too were going pretty fast. They reached my car, and the first one began to pass me. I glanced over to see that this man was also wearing a skeleton mask. He passed me and drove side by side with the car ahead of me. The next car pulled forward, and then another. Every driver of these cars was wearing skeleton masks. I looked behind me and saw even more cars. By now I was completely surrounded by these skeleton mask drivers. I started to get really creeped out, and I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't know what was going on and if these people were trying to run me off the road or something. I kept driving, and before long the cars seemed to get closer to me. I knew I would have to do something, and I was hoping that an exit would come up. About a mile later, I was happy to see an exit finally come. I maintained my speed with the cars closing in on me, and at the last second, I swerved onto the exit ramp from the freeway. The 2 cars in front of me and the one next to me were unable to make the exit, so it was just me and a bunch of cars following me now. I took a right and frantically looked around for where I should drive. There were about 5 cars trailing me. I drove down the road, and one of the cars behind me started to speed up to pass. We passed a restaurant and another business, but then I saw a gas station, and to my surprise, I happened to notice a police car parked at it. I quickly swerved over and entered the station and drove my car right next to the police and parked. A few of the cars pulled in and then drove through the gas station and left. I waited for the officer to return to his car from the convenience store, and when he did, I told him about my situation. He said he would alert the other police in the area, and even offered to drive a few miles behind me on the freeway to make sure I wouldn't get followed again. That is exactly what we did, and I was able to make it safely to my hotel about an hour later. A few years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip because I was moving from one side of the country to the other. It was just me, all by myself, and I enjoyed being able to live out of my car for a while. The only problem was that I had an old car that was on its last legs. I was planning to purchase a new car and get rid of the old one, but I decided to wait until after I moved because of all the hassle. The car would occasionally die, but for the first part of the trip it did great. On the 3rd day it was really hot, and after driving almost non-stop for about 10 hours, night came. and I was driving on the highways. Then I felt my car starting to die. It was about 9 p.m., and the road I was on was very quiet. It was not a major freeway because I was taking what the map told me was a shortcut. Instead, it was a little highway surrounded by mainly woods. I did not want to be stranded here. My car slowed down and came to a stop on the side of the road. I shut it off and waited a few minutes before trying to start it again. When I did, nothing happened at all. Then I took out my phone to call for help. But unfortunately, I saw that I had no service. I wasn't sure what to do. I decided to walk out of my car and see if my service would work a little ways up the road. I walked about 20 feet up the road, looking at my phone to see if I would receive any bars. Just then, I heard a noise come from the woods. I thought it was probably a deer, but when I looked, I didn't see a deer. Instead, I saw legs of a man. I couldn't see the rest of him from the trees. I didn't know why a man would be in the woods at this time. It made me uncomfortable, so I walked back to my car. I got in, shut the door, and locked it. I looked into the woods from my car, but I didn't see anything. I went back to my phone and decided to restart it to see if maybe that would get me some service. It was a long shot, but I needed to try what I could. As my phone was restarting, I heard a noise to the right of my car. I looked, and my heart stopped when I saw a man standing at my passenger's window, looking in. He looked dirty and was not wearing a shirt. He started trying to open the door. When it didn't open, he started banging on the window. I sat there for a few seconds, frozen with fear. Finally, I began to yell at him to go away, but it didn't seem to work. I tried my phone to call the police, but it still didn't have any service. Then, the man suddenly stopped banging and ran back towards the woods. I saw him grab a large stick and then start to walk back to my car. I was about to get out and run away. I didn't have a plan after that, but I didn't feel safe in my car with that guy banging on it. As soon as I started to open my door, I saw bright headlights of a truck pulling behind me. The truck came to a stop behind my car. I got out and walked to it. It was a large-looking man who was wearing a camel jacket and started to ask if I needed a tow. But in the middle of his sentence, he saw the man with the stick arrive at my car. I told him the man seemed to be insane and was trying to get into my car. The man in the truck then reached under his seat, grabbed a gun, and got out and yelled at the man. When the shirtless guy saw the gun, he dropped his stick and put his hands in the air. The man from the truck gave me his phone and told me to call the police. Luckily, he had service on his phone, and we waited until the police showed up. It was a crazy night that I will never forget. The old man got taken away and my car got towed. I stayed in a nearby town at a hotel that night, and after my car was fixed, I sold it. 2 summers ago, I was on a cross-country road trip with my wife. We were going to visit relatives for a big family gathering. We chose to drive because we could make several stops along the way of cities that we liked. Plus, we had some extra time. The first day we drove a good 8 or 9 hours and then stopped in for the evening. On the second day, we wanted to make it a little bit farther, so we drove a little later into the night. We got off the freeway at about 11 p.m. and went onto a highway. The highway had woods on both sides of it and was pretty quiet at this time. We only saw a couple of other cars on the road. About 10 minutes into being on that road, we saw what appeared to be a man standing in the middle of the road waving his arms. I slammed on my brakes to slow down. When we got closer, we could see that it was an older-looking man who appeared to be in his 70s. He looked like he was in trouble, and we stopped the car. The old man came up to my driver's window, and I rolled it down just a crack. He seemed genuinely concerned. He said that his car ran out of gas a ways back off a side road, and he was walking to try to get back to his house. He asked if we could drive him to his house and said it was just a couple miles away. My instant reaction, of course, was to say no, and I really wished that I did. But the old man seemed so harmless, so I figured, Why not help the guy out? I told him to get in the back, and I would give him a ride. He got into the back seat of my car and said thank you to us several times. Then he told us his house was just up the road, and he had some gas he could take to his car in his other truck. He directed us to his house. We drove up the road about a mile, then took an exit to a very quiet road surrounded by dense woods on both sides. We continued down this road for a minute or so when the man told us to turn at what appeared to be a driveway. I pulled into it and asked the man if this was his driveway. He said yes, but then asked if we could drive farther up. It was a skinny driveway that winded around, and I could not see very far in front because of all the trees. I kept driving down the skinny drive. I started to get a bad feeling. Then the skinny road turned into a clearing. The man said this was fine and we could drop him off here. Then he got out of my car. But as soon as he got out, I saw movement coming from the woods behind my car. Then I turned and saw more moving in the front. I didn't hesitate at all, and I stomped on the gas and put my car in reverse, not even knowing what it was. My wife then started to scream. I looked and saw multiple men running at my car from 2 different directions. I backed out the skinny driveway as fast as I could. A man hit the side of my car with something. I don't even know what. I got out of the driveway and back onto the road and sped off to the highway. My wife was shaking, and I have to admit that I was too. I don't know what kind of trap that old man was trying to lure us into, but I know I'm never stopping to pick anyone up again. Last year, I set out on a long road trip for work. I travel a lot for my job, but I'll skip those details and get straight to what happened. I left the city around 4 p.m., knowing I'd be driving late into the night, and wouldn't reach my hotel until around 2 in the morning. For the first few hours, the roads were packed with cars, but as the night went on, the traffic thinned until it was just me and the empty, dark road stretching ahead. Around 1 in the morning, I was about an hour and a half from my destination, feeling pretty good with the clear roads. I was driving through a remote stretch of highway when, out of nowhere, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. A car was approaching fast. I was already in the right lane, so I assumed it would just zoom past me, but instead it caught up to my car and slowed down to match my speed. I glanced over to get a better look. It was an old, beat-up car with duct tape covering one of the windows, and the driver, he was wearing a skeleton mask. He looked straight at me for a long, eerie second before speeding up and pulling ahead, taking the lane right in front of me. I shook it off, just trying to focus on the road. But then I saw more headlights approaching. More cars were catching up, and each one was going fast. One car pulled up beside me, and when I looked over, I saw another skeleton mask. This driver too stared at me before he took the spot next to the first car. Soon another car came up beside me, and then another behind, each with drivers wearing those eerie, hollow skeleton masks. Suddenly I was surrounded by them, skeleton-masked drivers in every direction, encircling me on this empty stretch of road in the middle of the night. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what they wanted or what was going on, but I knew it wasn't good. They inched closer, tightening their circle around my car. I felt trapped, like they were closing in on me. I tried to stay calm, but panic set in as the cars got even closer, squeezing me between them. I prayed for an exit, a way out of this nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted an exit sign up ahead. The cars around me showed no sign of slowing down, so I held my breath and at the last possible second, veered sharply onto the exit ramp, hoping to lose them. The maneuver caught them off guard. 2 of the cars in front of me sped right past, unable to follow. But a handful of the skeleton-masked drivers took the exit and were still on my tail. I raced down the deserted road, desperate for a way to shake them off. We passed a few closed businesses, and then, to my relief, I saw a gas station with a police car parked outside. Without hesitation, I swerved into the gas station, pulling up right next to the police car. The skeleton-masked drivers hesitated, slowing down as they neared the gas station. Some of them pulled in, only to drive through before peeling off into the night. Eventually, they all left. I stayed in my car, my heart racing, until the officer returned from inside the gas station. I explained what had happened, and he assured me he'd alert other officers in the area. He even offered to follow me on the freeway for a few miles to make sure I wasn't followed again. With the officer trailing behind me, I made it safely to my hotel about an hour later. But that night still haunts me. The eerie stares, the skeletal faces, and the feeling of being hunted. I still don't know who they were or why they targeted me, but I'll never forget that night on the open road, or those hollow eyes staring at me through those masks. A few years back, I was on a solo cross-country road trip, driving an old, worn-out car. I knew it was a gamble to take this car on such a long journey. It was on its last legs. But I wanted to wait until after I moved to get a new one, thinking I'd save myself the hassle. The first few days of driving went smoothly, though the car had a history of stalling. But by day 3, the heat was relentless, and I'd been driving for nearly 10 hours. As night fell, exhaustion weighed heavy on me, and I found myself on a small, isolated highway surrounded by dark, dense woods. It was around 9 p.m. when I felt it, the car beginning to sputter. My heart sank. The road was completely deserted, and with each mile behind me, I'd been slipping deeper into the wilderness. The engine whined, choked, and then the car slowly rolled to a stop at the roadside. I sat in the silence for a moment, my only company the sound of the trees rustling in the night. I tried to start the car again. Nothing. Not a click, not a hum. Frustrated, I reached for my phone to call for help. But when I looked down, dread twisted in my stomach. No service. My mind raced as I realized I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, alone with no cell signal. I thought maybe, if I walked a little down the road, I might catch a signal. I got out and walked about 20 feet, holding my phone up to the sky, praying for even a single bar. Just then, a noise drifted from the woods, a faint rustling followed by a soft crunch of leaves. I turned, expecting maybe a deer, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Between the trees, partially obscured by shadows, were legs, human legs. I couldn't make out the face, only those legs standing eerily still. The sight struck a strange terror in me. Why would anyone be out here at this hour, lurking in the woods? I quickly walked back to my car, locked myself inside and tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably nothing, just a hiker or maybe even my imagination. But then I heard a noise close by, right next to my passenger window. Slowly I turned my head, and there he was. A man was standing inches from my window, his face inches from the glass. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and intense. He looked dirty, disheveled and shirtless, his hair matted, his skin pale against the night. He reached for the door handle, tugging at it, trying to open it. When it didn't budge, his expression twisted, and he began banging on the window, each thud sending a shock through me. Frozen in terror, I could barely breathe. I screamed at him to go away, but he didn't seem to care. Desperately, I looked down at my phone again, willing it to work, but still no service. And then, as suddenly as he'd started, the banging stopped. I looked up to see him backing away from the car. My heart barely had time to settle before he reached down, picked up a heavy stick, and began walking back towards me, gripping it tightly in his hands. I was trapped. I knew I couldn't stay in the car, not with him coming at me like that. But if I ran, where would I go? Just as I was about to make a break for it, I saw bright headlights illuminating the dark road behind me. A large truck pulling up, stopping just a few feet behind my car. I bolted from my car and ran towards the truck. relief washing over me. The driver was a big guy, wearing a camouflage jacket, and he asked if I needed help. Before I could fully explain, he looked past me and saw the shirtless man approaching, wielding that stick. The driver's face hardened, and he reached under his seat, pulling out a gun. Without hesitation, he stepped out of the truck, aiming it squarely at the man, shouting for him to back off. The shirtless man froze, his hands slowly rising into the air, the stick falling to the ground. The truck driver handed me his phone, urging me to call the police, and thank God his phone had service. We waited there, the driver keeping a close eye on the man until the authorities arrived. The police took the shirtless man into custody, and as they led him away, I caught one last look at his face. His eyes, hollow and wild, lingered on me until he disappeared into the back of the police car. That night, I stayed at a small hotel in a nearby town, still shaken from what had happened. As soon as my car was fixed, I sold it the moment I reached my new home. That old car had given me one last memory, one I would never, ever forget. Even now, I can still hear the banging on the window, the stick scraping against the gravel, and that dark, piercing gaze staring at me through the glass. It was a cold winter night, probably one of the darkest December nights I had ever seen. I was 17, just a curious teenager, a bit too intrigued by the things others feared to look at. It was supposed to be a peaceful night at home. Everyone else had long gone to bed, leaving me alone with nothing but my laptop and an unquenchable thirst for mystery. You know how it goes. 1 minute you're watching cat videos on YouTube, and the next you've fallen into a deep rabbit hole, one where you're too far gone to turn back. That night I stumbled upon a video titled Dark Web Horror Stories, What They Don't Want You to Know. At first I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just another spooky video designed to spook out gullible teenagers like me, but something about it, I don't know. It felt different. The faceless narrator told chilling stories of horrors just beyond our reach. Stories of people like me who'd gotten far too curious. I shouldn't have watched it, but I was hooked. The images they painted in my mind didn't scare me. They intrigued me. The dark web, a place where horrors waited just a click away. The more I thought about it, the more I wanted to see it for myself. Could these things be real? Could I really find the forbidden, hidden corners of the internet, the ones where things went bump in the night? I did some research, found out that to access the dark web, you needed a special browser called Tor, and you also had to be careful, which meant a VPN. I hesitated for a while, nerves shooting through my chest, but curiosity won out. I was 17, full of pride, thinking I was invincible, above the fears others had. So that night, with the entire house shrouded in silence, I snuck out of bed, cracked open my laptop, and set everything up. I entered the dark web. At first, nothing happened. It was just what I expected. A chaotic maze of sites with cryptic random names and strange descriptions. Private chats, secret marketplaces, encrypted forums. Nothing too unusual. But then, something caught my eye. A site that didn't look like the others. The screen was completely black, the text barely readable, as if someone went out of their way to make sure it wasn't found. There was no homepage, no welcome message, just one link. It was plain, simple, enter. My heart pounded. It was as if the link was calling to me. I paused for a moment, wondering what the hell I was doing, but my curiosity had already overwhelmed any logical thought. My hand clicked the link. Within moments, a small window popped up on my screen. Please accept our terms and conditions to continue. 2 buttons appeared. Accept and exit. Every part of me screamed to click exit. Every fiber of my being told me to leave before it was too late. But I didn't. I clicked accept. A new screen loaded, and I felt the hairs on my neck stand. It asked for my age. I didn't know why, but without thinking, I typed 18. Why? Maybe because I thought that was what they wanted to hear. But I didn't even realize what I was getting into until the screen changed. No text, no instructions. Just a black screen, flickering slightly as it loaded something that felt wrong. I felt an icy weight settle in my stomach. Then it started. A dark green screen appeared, followed by an image, a vast barren desert stretching out endlessly under a bruised sky, as if the earth itself had been abandoned. It was so empty that the silence felt deafening. I could almost hear the wind howling across the desolation. It was beautiful. And then I saw the car. A dusty old sedan skimming across the sand, the tires kicking up thick clouds behind it. The car skidded to a halt. 2 men emerged from it, dragging something. At first I thought it was a bundle of cloth, but as they moved into the frame it became painfully clear. It was a person. 2 people, bound, their bodies limp, as though they were no longer human. The men dragged them like rag dolls, and the air around me grew cold. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of it. One of the men bent down, pulling the lifeless bodies into the sand. He didn't look at them as he shoved them down, as if this was routine. The other man returned to the car and came back with a metal canister. The sun gleamed off of it for a second before he opened it. My stomach turned. I had seen this kind of scene in films, heard the stories, but never in real life. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I knew what was coming. Then the man pulled out a match. He struck it, and in an instant, flames erupted, licking the bodies. The fire roared to life, dancing in the air as the figures writhed, their flesh burning, but there was no sound. The fire crackled, but there was no scream, no wail, no cry of agony, only silence. It was the silence that made it worse. The flames consumed them hungrily. I felt myself go numb, unable to look away. I wanted to scream, to stop watching, but I couldn't. And then, as if he had felt my presence through the screen, one of the men turned slowly, his eyes locked with mine, cold, lifeless. For a split second it felt like he was staring right through me. And then he raised something, a piece of cardboard. On it, written in stark red letters, "Do you like watching?" I froze. My body went cold, and a heavy, suffocating sensation washed over me. I tried to close the laptop, but my fingers wouldn't move. My heartbeat was thunderous in my chest as I realized I had just watched something I was never meant to see. Something so real, too real. I slammed the laptop shut with trembling hands, my entire body shaking, but even then I could feel the weight of the screen, as if the green light was still flickering at me from inside the darkness. I lay in bed that night, too terrified to sleep. My mind replayed those images, those bodies burning, the eyes staring through the screen, the question that chilled me to my core. I couldn't get it out of my head. It was like I had invited something in, something that watched me, waiting for me to return. The next morning I tried to convince myself it was all a sick, staged thing, a video meant to scare people. But deep down I knew the truth. It wasn't fake. I deleted Tor. I erased the VPN. I did everything I could to bury it. But sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I swear I see that green light flickering in the corner of my vision. It's like they're still watching, waiting. I don't know if it's just paranoia, or if they really are out there. I was 17 when I first heard about the dark web. It was one of those late-night rabbit holes, you know, when you're half-dazed from clicking link after link, diving deeper into a world you never intended to discover. At first it was just some random videos, dark web horror stories, eerie tales told by faceless narrators, warning of the things that lurked just beyond the veil. That night, one video stood out. A faceless man, his voice cold and detached, spoke of things I couldn't even comprehend. He described sights that shouldn't exist, horrors so vile they didn't belong in our world. I couldn't look away. Instead of scaring me off, it pulled me deeper. How real was it? Could I actually see these things for myself? The thrill was intoxicating, and the mystery. It was like a temptation I couldn't resist. I didn't think twice. I'd heard enough about the hidden corners of the web, where nothing was as it seemed. Everyone else around me was asleep. It felt like the perfect time to take a deeper dive. I had an old copy of Tor, a browser built to slip through the cracks of the internet unnoticed, and a VPN to cover my tracks. I thought it would be harmless. After all, I wasn't looking for anything illegal, just some old books, maybe a few rare finds. That was the plan. But then, curiosity got the best of me. I started browsing, flipping through directory listings on the dark web, each one more cryptic than the last. I wasn't looking for anything dangerous, or so I thought. I came across one that stood out: Sanctum Services. No flashy logos, no bright colors, just stark white text on a black background. The description was vague, almost too vague. Items for protection, enforcement, and elimination. I couldn't stop myself from clicking. The page loaded slowly, painfully so, like the site was contemplating whether it even wanted me there. The screen flickered and then settled into a black background. The words "loading" blinked in a way that felt deliberate, like the site was studying me, deciding whether I should be allowed to continue. My hands trembled, but I couldn't look away. Finally, the page loaded. It looked like an e-commerce site, only far darker, less inviting. There were no sale banners, no warm greetings. Instead, there were categories like weapons, specialists, connections. Each one felt heavier than the last, like a shadow pressing against my chest. Before I could process what I was seeing, a pop-up flashed on my screen. This site has attempted to access restricted functions. I dismissed it, still too intrigued to care. But then, my screen went black. For a moment it was just me, my face reflected in the dark screen, and the eerie silence of the room. And then the webcam light flickered on. My heart dropped into my stomach. The small green light that usually went unnoticed was now glaring at me. Someone was watching me. Worse, they wanted me to know it. My hands froze, hovering above the keys. Who were they? What did they want? Then, like a slow burn, the text started to appear on the screen. It typed itself, letter by letter, slow and deliberate. Why did you come here? Every cell in my body screamed to shut the laptop, to disconnect, to leave. But I couldn't. My fingers trembled as I typed. I was just looking. The cursor blinked, waiting for a response. I barely had time to think before the text changed. Leave now. My breath hitched, and I tried to close the window, my hands flying across the keyboard. I spammed the keys, hitting the escape button over and over. But the webcam light blinked again, almost as if it were mocking me. Finally, the screen went dark. I couldn't move. I just sat there, paralyzed in the silence that enveloped me. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very air was thick with something I couldn't name. But the worst part? I knew it wasn't over. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't even touch the laptop. The webcam light had burned itself into my mind as though someone was watching me, studying me. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards felt amplified. I couldn't sleep. The haunting feeling of eyes on me was too much. 2 years passed, and I convinced myself it was just a glitch. A weird thing with my webcam, maybe. So when I found myself back on Tor, browsing cautiously, I convinced myself that the past was behind me. I stuck to what I knew, the Imperial Library of Trainer, a place known for rare books and obscure records. I wasn't looking for trouble. I had nearly forgotten the shadow that still lingered in my memory until I saw it again. The listing for Sanctum Services appeared again, like some forgotten nightmare crawling out of the dark. My heart froze. I knew I shouldn't click it, but the temptation was too strong. I clicked. This time, the page loaded instantly, no delay, no ominous waiting. But something was wrong. The categories had changed. Live feeds. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to know what that meant. I clicked. A small window appeared, showing a list of streams. Some were live, others were offline. My eyes scanned the titles. Room 34, Facility Z, Hallway 12. Most of the rooms were empty, but one was not. It showed a figure bound to a chair, bruised and bloodied. His eyes were hollow, staring at the camera with a gaze that pierced through me. It was too real, too disturbing. I'd heard the stories, the ones about live feeds, auctions, and people being sold for entertainment. But seeing it with my own eyes, that was something else. I tried to close the window, my stomach churning, but then my screen flickered again, and the webcam light turned on. This time there was no black screen, just me staring back at my reflection, frozen in horror. Welcome back. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing, but the feeling didn't go away. For the next week, I couldn't touch my computer. Every time I glanced at it, I swore I saw the faint glow of the screen, like it was waiting for me to come back, like it was watching me. Then, 2 nights later, I woke to the faint glow of my laptop screen across the room. I hadn't left it on. I hadn't even touched it. But there it was, the screen faintly illuminating the room, and on it, a single word in bold, blood-red letters: run. I wish I could say I ran, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen in place, staring at the screen as it slowly, eerily faded to black. I still remember the first time I felt the pull of the deep web. It was 5 years ago, a night just like any other, when a late-night rabbit hole led me to something darker. I had spent hours reading about it, one article after another, about hidden places only accessible through something called Tor. The stories all sounded like urban legends, secret sites full of things you'd never find on the normal internet. But curiosity, that dark, forbidden curiosity, got the best of me. I'd heard whispers of what lay beyond the surface web. Stolen goods, dark marketplaces, and even worse, places where you could get anything, do anything. I told myself it was just some strange place for out-of-print books or rare finds. But as soon as I opened Tor, I realized I had no idea what I was walking into. The first place I was told to visit was the Hidden Wiki. It wasn't flashy or designed to draw you in. It was just a plain page with links to sites with names I could barely pronounce. Most of the topics were disturbing, some so grotesque I almost closed the window, but something kept me scrolling. The tone was what stuck with me. It was detached, clinical even. This wasn't some underworld written about with shock or anger. This was just normal. Then I came across a link that caught my eye. The Bug Catchers Cult. I won't get into what it was about, but the descriptions were so graphic, so deeply wrong that I almost felt like I'd made a mistake. I quickly closed it, but my hands shook. This wasn't a place for books, this was something darker. And then at the bottom of the page, I saw it. A link that wasn't like the others. No description, no catchy title, just a cold, unmarked URL. Against all instincts, I clicked on it. The page flickered. For a moment I thought maybe I'd triggered some kind of error. But then the screen loaded, revealing a single sentence in stark white text. Are you ready to see the truth? My heart pounded in my chest. The screen seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, like it was waiting for something. I hesitated, feeling a pull in my gut. And then before I could stop myself, I typed, I don't know. The words on the screen changed immediately, as if it was reading my thoughts. Curiosity comes at a price. I felt my stomach drop. Then the images started. First, they were just flashes, twisted faces, contorted bodies, scenes that didn't make sense. But then they grew clearer. Faces that weren't human, half-finished, grotesque, as if they'd been stitched together in the dark. A figure bound to a chair, face bruised and eyes hollow with terror. The images spiraled faster, each one more disturbing than the last. My hand shook as I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Something in me. Then came the live feed. It was dimly lit, but it didn't matter. In the center of the room sat a chair, empty. But as I stared, a figure appeared. A person, hunched over, bound and silent. Their face wasn't visible at first, but then the camera shifted, revealing a face I couldn't forget. It was Marcos, a name I recognized from one of the old forums, a name linked to the Sanctum service, a legend I had read about in hushed whispers. Marcos, the enforcer, the one who dealt with problems, no questions asked. But something was off. The shadows moved behind him. Not normal shadows, though. These were alive. They shifted in the dark corners, watching, waiting. "You could be here," the text appeared on the screen. My heart skipped a beat. It was like the screen was taunting me. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound of the metal clanging too loud in the still room. But then I heard something. A faint beep. It was coming from the laptop. Slowly, I opened it, and there, in the center of the screen, was a single line of text. "Don't try to hide. We see you." I froze. I ripped the battery out of the laptop, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. But the message didn't stop. My mind raced. How could they know? I wasn't even sure if I was dreaming. Was I being watched right now from somewhere out there in the void? I listened to the silence, to the way every creak in the house felt amplified, as though I was being stalked. I didn't sleep for days. Each time I opened my laptop, I checked for any signs of strange programs running in the background, for anything that felt off. But nothing ever showed up. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, the creeping dread, the sense that someone somewhere was waiting for me to slip up. Then one night, almost a year later, I found myself on tour again. I thought it was over, that I was safe, but I wasn't. I clicked on a link titled Sanctum Live. I knew it was a mistake the moment the page loaded. The first feed I clicked on showed a room, but it wasn't empty. Someone was tied to a chair in the center, a man named David. His face was familiar. He'd been one of the bug catchers, someone I'd read about. His lips were sealed with a strange waxy substance, his eyes wide open in silent horror. A shadow moved behind him, tall, looming. Then another feed popped up. This one wasn't live, but it showed something that made my blood run cold. It was an image of my own face, captured through my webcam. No green light this time, just the cold reflection of me, staring back at myself, terrified. "We know who you are," the text read. I slammed the laptop shut again, but it didn't matter. The fear I'd felt before was nothing compared to what I felt now. I could feel the eyes on me, watching me, waiting. I could feel Marcos's presence in the room, even though I knew he wasn't there. It's been months since that night, but I still hear the faintest noise sometimes. A click, a whisper, a shadow that moves just out of sight. The worst part? I don't think I'll ever be free of them. They're out there, somewhere, and they know my name. It was one of those cold, biting March nights, the kind where the chill seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I had just stumbled through the door after a long shift, exhaustion hitting me like a ton of bricks. All I wanted was a moment of peace, a cold beer in hand and the comfort of silence. I sank onto the couch, eyes closed, hoping the quiet would wash away the stress clinging to me. But peace, as it turned out, was the last thing that night had in store. I took a long sip, barely bothering to turn on the TV. The house was calm, quiet, almost too still. I felt an odd prickling at the back of my mind, but I brushed it off, blaming it on the exhaustion. As I flipped mindlessly through the channels, the screen suddenly went dark. Every light in the house flickered once, then died with a sharp electric pop that echoed through the silence. My heart raced, even though I was used to these outages. Our house had a habit of losing power for no apparent reason, but that night it felt different, ominous. Curious, I stepped outside to check if the outage had affected the neighborhood. As the door closed softly behind me, I glanced around. A few houses were still lit up, their windows glowing softly in the dark. The problem was just my house. Frustrated, I turned back, but as I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. My stomach twisted. I tried again, rattling the handle harder, but it was locked. My heart began to pound as I pounded on the door, calling out to my wife. Silence. Panic set in, clawing up my throat as I raced to the back door, locked, every entry sealed shut. A deep chill crept into my bones. Something was terribly wrong. My pulse raced as I made my way around to the side of the house, hoping to check the breaker. But then, I froze. The garden hose, which I'd coiled neatly just hours before, was unspooled and strewn haphazardly across the yard. It lay limp on the grass, snaking toward the breaker box, its purpose clear as day. Someone had been here. Someone had cut the power, and they were still inside. Cold dread took hold as I crept to a nearby window, peering into the darkness of my own home. Two beams of light swayed through the shadows, flashlights dancing like restless spirits, illuminating unfamiliar shapes in my living room. My mind went numb with fury and terror. Intruders were rifling through my home as if they owned it. I reached instinctively for my phone, but my pocket was empty. I'd left it on the couch in my rush for comfort. A curse slipped through my clenched teeth. I knew I should run to the neighbors for help, call the police, get someone here fast. But a horrible thought seized me, gripping me tighter than fear itself. My wife was still inside, asleep and unaware, a silent target in her own home. I couldn't leave her there, vulnerable to whatever was lurking in the dark. Grabbing a handful of rocks from the garden, I hurled one at our bedroom window. The silence shattered. A second rock, then a third, until I saw her startled face appear in the window, her eyes wide with confusion. I gestured frantically, mouthing to her to hide, to stay silent. She vanished from view, disappearing into the shadows. With my heart hammering, I sprinted to my neighbor's door, pounding on it with desperate urgency. After explaining, barely catching my breath, I used his phone to call the police, my voice a mix of rage and terror. As I waited on his porch, every second felt like a lifetime. The dark consuming my fears, my hopes, all but the raw dread clawing at my chest. Finally, the police arrived, their flashing lights piercing the dark. I ran out to meet them, leading them to the back of the house. They swept inside, weapons drawn, but it was too late. The back door hung ajar, swinging slightly, a mocking reminder of our vulnerability. Whoever had been there had vanished into the night, leaving only the chilling echo of their intrusion behind. My wife's face was pale, her hands shaking as she clung to me. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, each word cutting deeper than the last. She described how moments after hiding, she heard the bedroom door creak open. A stranger's heavy steps entered, stopping only a few feet away, and then she heard it. The unmistakable metallic click of a gun cocking, the stranger standing motionless, listening. She lay there, hidden and paralyzed, while the intruder lingered, as though savoring the terror he had instilled. She was certain he had heard me throwing the rocks, and it may have saved her life. To this day, I can't shake the guilt, the chilling what-ifs that haunt me. What if I hadn't gone outside? What if I hadn't thrown the rocks? Even now, when I walk through that door every night, there's a part of me that wonders if I'll feel that same terrifying chill again, because we never did move. We still live in that house, and every creak, every shadow in the corner of my eye, it feels like they're still there, watching, waiting. It had been a stormy Friday night, the kind that sets a heavy, foreboding mood over the world, making everything seem dark and twisted. The wind howled like a beast, slamming against the house, rattling the windows as if the elements themselves were trying to tear it apart. Outside, the rain lashed against the glass in sheets, so thick it looked like a wall of water, blocking out everything beyond. The storm felt alive, as though it were watching, waiting, but inside, in the dim glow of the basement, it was oddly peaceful, almost cozy in its own eerie way. I had just moved back in with my parents, defeated by the struggles of life. My older brother, the golden child, had always been the successful one, the one who had it all figured out. I'd spent years trying to follow in his footsteps, but I always seemed to be a few steps behind. It wasn't that I resented him, it was just the way life worked out. And now, after years of trying to make it on my own, I was back home, living in the basement, tucked away from the world like some forgotten shadow. My parents were out for the weekend, leaving me to my own devices. The basement was far from a typical dreary storage space. It had a sort of strange charm to it. A small kitchen, a bathroom, an office, and a bedroom with a bed that, while small, was just enough to make me feel like I was still somewhat independent. There was a TV with my old video games, which felt like a small piece of my old life. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep me distracted from the relentless frustration of being stuck. That night, I had settled in with a beer, the warmth of the storm outside the perfect backdrop to my peaceful escape. The wind outside roared, pushing against the house, but here in my basement, I was sheltered from it all. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the storm wash over me, the rhythm of the rain against the windows lulling me towards sleep. But then, it happened. The lights flickered, and without warning, everything went black. The sudden silence that followed felt unnatural. The hum of electricity, the comforting glow of the lights, all of it disappeared in an instant. I groaned in annoyance. The storm had probably knocked out the power, I thought. I didn't want to deal with it. I was tired, too tired to be bothered. I didn't even know where the breaker was, and honestly, I didn't care. It was just a power outage, nothing to worry about. I closed my eyes again, trying to ignore the dark, empty space around me. But the quiet was unsettling. There was something about it that didn't sit right, something off. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered like a shadow. And then I heard it. A loud thud. Unnatural. Heavy. It hit one of the basement windows with such force that I jumped, my heart racing in my chest. My first thought was that a tree branch had fallen, or maybe the storm had knocked something loose. But this was different. It was too sharp, too deliberate, like someone had thrown something. Reluctantly, I grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to navigate through the pitch-black room. Every step felt like it echoed in the silence, like the house itself was holding its breath. As I approached the window, I held my phone up, squinting through the glass, trying to see through the darkness outside. And then I saw it. My blood ran cold. There, pressed against the window, was a face. A man's face, pale and drenched from the rain, eyes wide open, staring straight at me. For a moment, time stopped. My heart stuttered in my chest as we locked eyes. And then, just as quickly, he moved away from the window. I stumbled back, almost dropping my phone, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What had I just seen? The terror in my chest was overwhelming. My mind raced, but before I could process what had happened, another sound reached my ears. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, creaking above me. Someone was upstairs, in my house. The panic surged within me. I was alone, and there were strangers in my home, but there was more. I knew they weren't just breaking in. They knew I was down here. I froze, my mind spinning. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then I remembered. The power outage had cut off the Wi-Fi. My phone had no signal down here in the basement. I was trapped alone and cut off from the outside world. There was no way to contact anyone, no way to call for help. The only thing I could do was wait. But waiting meant the strangers would have time to find me, and they were coming. I tried to think, tried to calm myself, but the panic was like a vice around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I couldn't just sit here, not while they were upstairs. I needed to get out. Quietly, I moved toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my throat. I reached the top and peered around the stairwell. My breath hitched. There were 3 figures moving through the house, their flashlights cutting through the dark. I watched, frozen in place. One of them turned, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across their body, and I saw it. A gun. My blood turned to ice. One of them was carrying a gun. I held my breath, not daring to move. They were murmuring to each other in low voices, their words muffled by the heavy storm outside. Then one of them said something that made my stomach drop. "Alex is in the basement. Go find him. How did they know my name?" My mind raced, the world spinning around me. They were looking for me. I had to get out. I had to move. But I was cornered. If they found me, I didn't know what would happen. I couldn't take the chance. I backed away from the stairs as quietly as I could, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. I couldn't let them hear me, couldn't let them know where I was. I searched frantically, looking for a way out. But the basement was sealed tight. All the windows were locked from the inside. There was no escape. But then I saw it, a stool, sitting by the corner. Without thinking, I grabbed it and dragged it over to one of the basement windows. It was my only shot. I climbed up, smashing my elbow through the glass, sending shards flying everywhere. The pain in my arm was sharp, but it didn't matter. I had no time to feel it. I pulled myself through the broken window, feeling the glass cut into my skin, but I didn't stop. The rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I ran, slipping in the mud, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to check if they were chasing me. I just ran as fast as I could until I reached a neighbor's house, and finally I got a signal on my phone. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely dial the police, but I managed to get through. By the time the officers arrived and searched the house, it was too late. Whoever had broken in was long gone, leaving nothing but chaos behind. They'd taken everything, stolen more than I could count. And the power outage? It had been no accident. It was intentional. The police couldn't offer any answers. No fingerprints, no clues. Just an empty house with all the signs of a brutal robbery. My parents were furious. They didn't understand how it could have happened, why I hadn't done more. They threatened to kick me out, to send me away. But I begged them. I couldn't leave. I had nowhere to go. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could stay either. Every night, I wonder. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of the lights makes my heart race. I can still see his face pressed against the window, and I can still hear the voice, calling my name from upstairs. They knew where I was. They knew my name. And that thought haunts me. Who were they? Why did they target me? What would have happened if I hadn't escaped? The answers are out there, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that they'll come back for me. Every storm that hits now feels like a warning, a reminder that I'm not alone. I can never forget what happened that night, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder. I'm a security guard and I work the night shift at a quiet suburban warehouse far away from any bustling city or town. It's as lonely as it sounds. My job isn't complicated. I walk the aisles, check the locks, and make sure no one's trying to steal anything. But there are nights when something feels. It was a Thursday night when everything changed. The rain hammered down in sheets, making the windows rattle and the roof groan under the pressure. I checked my phone, watching the storm updates. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of driving home in those conditions, but I told myself I could make it through. It was eerily quiet. The only sound was the occasional hum of the lights above and the distant thrum of thunder. But as the hours ticked by, the storm outside grew more intense, and the power inside the warehouse began to flicker. At first, it was nothing serious, just a few moments of darkness, but it came back each time. Then, it happened. The lights went out completely. The warehouse was plunged into a suffocating darkness so thick it felt like it could swallow me whole. My heart skipped a beat. I cursed under my breath, realizing that the responsibility for fixing it now rested solely on my shoulders. It wasn't a difficult task. Just unplug some machinery, check the breakers, and get the lights back on. But the thought of navigating this massive dark building alone made my skin crawl. My flashlight flickered on, the beam of light cutting through the oppressive dark like a tiny sliver of hope. My footsteps echoed off the metal shelves, each one sounding louder than the last. It was unsettling. The silence in the warehouse was unnatural, and each creak of the building felt like an unseen presence was lurking just out of sight. As I began my task, I heard it. A loud metallic clatter, distant but unmistakable. It rang out from somewhere deep within the warehouse. I froze. My mind tried to reason with itself, telling me it was just the storm, the wind shaking the building, but the sound, it didn't belong. I should have ignored it. I should have gone straight to the breakers, but curiosity gnawed at me. I walked toward the source of the noise, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I turned a corner, my breath caught in my throat. A faint beam of light darted across the shelves, moving just like my own flashlight. It clicked off as quickly as I saw it, disappearing into the dark. I blinked, staring at the spot where the light had been. No one should have been here. I was the only one on shift tonight. I took a step forward, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow. I called out into the empty aisles, but no response came. It was just me. Or so I thought. When I reached the spot where I had seen the light, the aisle was empty. Just rows and rows of crates stacked high, casting eerie shadows in the dim light. I wasn't imagining it. I knew what I had seen. My gut twisted. Something was wrong. I considered calling the police, but then I thought better of it. What would I tell them? That I saw a light, but no one was here? They'd think I was losing it. Still, something wasn't right. I shook my head and pushed the thought aside. I had a job to do. The lights wouldn't fix themselves. But just as I made my way toward the circuit room, I was hit by a smell. It was metallic, stale, like rusted iron mixed with stagnant water. The stench was coming from one of the loading bays where crates were piled high, floor to ceiling. My flashlight flickered across the polished concrete floor, and that's when I saw it. 2 sets of wet footprints. They were fresh, and they led into one of the storage aisles. My stomach twisted, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. The logical part of me told me to leave, to call the police, to get out. But my job was to protect this place. I couldn't just leave. I followed the trail, my feet moving despite the fear clawing at my insides. The closer I got, the more I heard it. The faintest whispers. Soft, almost drowned out by the storm outside. It sounded like 2 people talking, but the words were unintelligible, carried on the wind of some unseen presence. The tone was tense, urgent, like something was about to go terribly wrong. I clicked off my flashlight and held my breath. I gripped my taser, praying it would be enough if I had to defend myself. I crept forward, my heart pounding in my ears, and turned the corner. Nothing. No one was there. The whispers stopped. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I stood in the empty aisle, my flashlight trembling in my hand. How? How could they have vanished so quickly? My thoughts were racing. This wasn't just a glitch. It was something much worse. But I couldn't just abandon my post. I had to get the lights back on. I couldn't risk losing my job over this. I found my way to the circuit room and began working on the breakers, my hands trembling as I fumbled in the dark. The silence was maddening, the weight of it pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. And then it happened. A scraping sound, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. My flashlight swung toward the noise. There, just a few feet away, was a crowbar, a metal tool lying innocently on the floor, but it hadn't been there before. I had just walked past this spot. Whoever was in here with me, they were armed. I called out, hoping to bluff whoever was out there. "I'm armed," I yelled, though my words felt hollow. My finger tightened on the taser, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this place a moment longer. Just as I turned to leave, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the building. My heart skipped a beat. The unmistakable sound of running footsteps followed, growing louder, faster. I spun around and ran. I could hear them behind me, the footsteps pounding the concrete like the beat of a war drum. Whoever they were coming for me, and they were fast. My only thought was to keep running, to get to the exit and never look back. I darted through the aisles, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the footsteps fading. The sound of pursuit slowly vanished. I dared to stop, my chest heaving, and for a moment I thought I had escaped. I made my way to the exit and stepped outside into the pouring rain, my legs shaking. My heart was still racing, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I called the police. The words tumbled out of my mouth in a panic. Please, come quickly. When they arrived, they searched the place, but the two figures were gone without a trace. The police were helpful, even resetting the power for me, but my boss? He wasn't so understanding. He gave me a hard time for leaving the job early, nearly firing me. I couldn't shake the images from that night. The figures, the crowbar, the whispers. What did they want? Why did they chase me? And the worst part, I still worked the night shift in that very warehouse. But now, at least, I'm not alone. My boss finally started putting a second person on the shift. But no matter how many people are with me, I can never forget the feeling that something is still lurking in those dark aisles, waiting for the next time the lights go out. And I pray that next time, I won't be alone. It was my first day at the new job as a secretary for a mid-sized insurance company, and I thought the worst thing that could happen would be a little bit of office stress. I couldn't have been more wrong. From the moment I walked in, everything felt off. It wasn't just the unfamiliar faces or the hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was the cold, unsettling tension in the air. Lucas, my boss, wasn't like the other managers I'd heard about. He was aggressive, sharp, and always watching. My first mistake, I printed out the wrong packet for his presentation. I knew something was wrong when his eyes locked on mine in front of everyone. His voice, low and venomous, echoed in the silence of the office. One more mistake, and you're gone. I could feel the weight of his gaze, like he was reading me, waiting for me to slip up again. The rest of the day dragged on in a fog. Every move I made felt like it was being monitored, watched. The air felt thick, like something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pounce. But then, the idea hit me. I needed to make things right, fast. I noticed that Lucas had a thing for Dunkin' Donuts. Every morning without fail, he picked up a dozen donuts. I thought to myself, maybe this would be the ticket to getting on his good side. So on Friday morning, I set my alarm for 6:30 a.m., hoping I could beat him there. When I walked into the donut shop, the warm scent of fresh pastries wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. But something felt wrong. The cashier was a young girl, Emma. Her smile was soft, yet there was an unease in her eyes I couldn't quite place. We exchanged pleasantries, and I told her how stressed I was about my new job. She nodded sympathetically, mentioning how she had just escaped a toxic relationship with a married man. She seemed relieved, but as I paid for the donuts, I noticed her gaze shift. Her eyes locked onto my uniform and her face dropped. She looked at me as if she'd seen a ghost. You work there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I asked her what was wrong, but she just handed me the donuts and said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine," her voice thick with something I couldn't place. A sense of dread washed over me as I left the shop. It was as though I had just stepped into a nightmare. Outside, I saw Lucas pulling into the parking lot, and without thinking, I ducked behind a car to hide. He entered the shop as I watched from the shadows, my heart pounding. I didn't know it then, but that moment was the last time I would ever see Emma alive. That evening, I sat down to watch the local news, my mind still occupied with the strange encounter at the donut shop. And then the report came on. A body had been discovered behind the Dunkin' Donuts, discarded in a dumpster like trash. It was Emma. My stomach churned as they showed her picture on the screen. She had been murdered that morning, her life violently snuffed out. The police were asking for any information that might lead to the killer, but they had no leads. Whoever did this had been careful, shutting off the security cameras in the restaurant before the deed was done. I froze, my thoughts raced. I had been one of the last people to see her alive, and I remembered that Lucas had been there too. He had entered the shop right after me. Surely he knew something. Maybe he could help. But I hesitated. Something told me that there was more to Lucas than I had ever suspected. That night I told myself I would ask him about it in the morning. The next day, Lucas was in his usual good spirits, a stark contrast to the grim atmosphere that had once hung over him. I seized the opportunity, pulling him aside into his office. I mentioned the murder, and his face paled for a moment before it quickly returned to its usual mask of calm. I asked if he remembered the girl working at Dunkin' that day. He stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you know about Emma?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile faltered, and for a split second, his mask cracked. "Why are you asking about her?" His voice was cold, his eyes narrowing into something dark, something predatory. I tried to press further, but he cut me off, refusing to tell me anything. Instead, he suggested that we go to the police together. I thought it was strange, but I agreed, desperate for answers. We got into the elevator together, and I thought we were heading to the ground floor, but Lucas pressed a button for the roof. Confused, I asked what was going on, but he only said he had a quick errand to run. As the elevator door slid open to the rooftop, my heart stopped. I could feel the air growing colder, the space between us growing more suffocating. Lucas pushed me onto the roof. His smile had vanished, replaced by a look I can only describe as madness. He locked the elevator behind us, trapping us on the roof. I could see it in his eyes. He was no longer the boss I feared. He was something else, something darker. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away, my pulse racing. You killed her, didn't you?" I whispered, terrified. Lucas smirked. "She rejected me," he said, his voice calm, almost indifferent. "And now she's gone. Just like you'll be if you say anything." I felt my legs weaken, but I refused to back down. "You don't have to do this," I pleaded, but it was too late. His grin twisted further, a look of triumph in his eyes. He moved closer, and in that moment I knew he was going to kill me too. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his hands reaching for me. "I wish I'd gotten to know you better." Before he could push me, I acted. Years of training in Taekwondo kicked in as I grabbed his wrists and twisted my body. In a split second, Lucas lost his balance and toppled backward, his body flying off the edge. The world stood still as I heard the sickening thud of his body hitting the concrete below. I looked down, my heart racing, and saw his lifeless form, his neck snapped at an unnatural angle. The police arrived soon after. I told them everything, about the rooftop, about Emma, about Lucas's confession. They didn't believe me at first, but when one of the officers unlocked Lucas's phone, the photos of him with Emma were all the proof they needed. They let me go, but warned me they might need me again later. That was a week ago. I'm still working at the same company, but without Lucas looming over me, the office feels different now, lighter somehow. The weight that had been crushing me for so long has finally lifted, but sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear his voice. That chilling, insane whisper, there weren't supposed to be any witnesses. And then, I wonder, was I the only one who survived? Jane, my sister, who had been staying at my place for a few days while her husband, Mark, was on a business trip. They'd only been married for less than a year, and I could see how much she missed him. I tried my best to cheer her up, but no matter what, her mind was always on Mark. On the first morning she was here, I decided to surprise her. There was a Dunkin' Donuts on the other side of town, and I knew it was her favorite. She was still fast asleep when I quietly slipped out the door and headed out. It was a long drive, but I didn't mind. I wanted to make her smile. I pulled up, parked, and rushed inside, ordering a half-dozen donuts, just enough for the two of us. I was in a hurry to get back before Jane woke up. I paid the cashier and turned around to leave, but then something made me pause. A chill ran down my spine as I saw them, Mark and a woman I didn't recognize, sitting in the back corner of the restaurant. Mark's face was turned away, trying to hide himself, but I knew it was him. He was supposed to be in another city on a business trip. My stomach dropped, and for a moment the room seemed to spin. Was he cheating on Jane? I couldn't make sense of it, but I couldn't ignore the reality of what I was seeing. The woman with him was acting nervously. Her face flushed, and Mark wasn't meeting my eyes. I walked up to their table, my voice trembling with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" I asked him, my heart racing. Mark mumbled something about picking up donuts for a work conference, but I knew it was a lie. They had only 2 donuts, one for each, and both were half-eaten. The woman's face turned bright red, a clear sign that she realized they had been caught. Anger surged through me, but I kept my voice steady. I had to show Jane. I pulled out my phone and snapped a quick photo of them, trying not to make it obvious. Without saying another word, I turned and walked back to the counter to grab the box of donuts. Mark shouted after me, but I ignored him, my mind whirling as I headed for the door. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to be the one to break Jane's heart. As soon as I got to my car, I sat there for a long moment, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, my mind reeling with the terrible discovery. I needed to go home and tell Jane, but how could I? I turned the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, but something caught my eye. Mark's car was following me. The roads were empty, and I could feel the tension in the air. Mark's beat-up Nissan was speeding behind me, not trying to hide that he was tailing me. He wasn't being subtle. He was tailgating me so closely that it felt like he might run me off the road at any second. I pushed my foot down on the gas, and so did he. The speedometer jumped, and panic gripped me as Mark's car swerved dangerously close to mine. He was honking, flashing his headlights, urging me to pull over. I had never seen Mark act like this. He had always been calm, reserved, a little boring even. But now he was a different person entirely. I was terrified. My heart was hammering in my chest. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, my hands shaking on the wheel. Then, the worst happened. Mark slammed into the back of my car. I felt the force jolt me forward, my body jerking against the seatbelt. The world around me seemed to blur as I lost control of the car. My vision swam, and in less than a second, I was careening off the road and crashing into a tree. Everything went black. I woke up to searing pain in my head, my body aching from the crash. I couldn't see anything, only darkness, the airbag still pressed against my face. I felt a throbbing pain in my nose. It had to be broken. But something else terrified me even more. The voices. I could hear Mark and the woman talking, but it wasn't just their voices that made me freeze. It was what they were saying. "Is she dead?" The woman's voice trembled. I sure hope so. Mark's voice was cold, too calm. My heart stopped. Mark didn't care about me. He was planning to leave me for dead. I felt a hand slip into my pocket, my phone being taken from me. The sickening sound of it being smashed followed, and then Mark's voice again. "What if she's still alive?" The woman sounded more concerned now, though I couldn't tell if she was worried about me or the possibility of being caught. "I'll handle it," Mark assured her, his voice dark. "Just stay calm." I felt hands grabbing me, pulling me from the wreckage, my body barely functioning. My only option was to pretend, to play dead. If I moved, if I showed any sign of life, he might finish what he started. I lay motionless, my body screaming in pain, my mind racing. Mark walked away, telling the woman he'd be right back. I could barely hear her through my agony as she muttered to herself. This was my chance. As fast as I could, I pushed myself up. Every part of my body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I had to escape. I limped, one of my ankles twisted at an odd angle, but I had no choice. I needed to get to safety. I could hear Mark coming back, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw him running toward me. I pushed myself harder, but the pain was too much. The incline was steep, and with every step it felt like my leg might snap. I was almost there, almost to the road, when Mark grabbed me by the shoulders, dragging me back down the hill. The pain in my ankle was unbearable. I gasped, tasting blood, trying to speak, but no words came out. "Why did you have to take that photo?" Mark's voice was a cold whisper as he stood over me. Tears blurred my vision. I couldn't answer him. I couldn't move. I could only watch in horror as he raised a huge rock over his head, his eyes wild with anger. "This will be easier," he muttered, his grip tightening, but just before he could bring it down, I heard a scream. Someone was coming toward us, the woman. She tackled Mark to the ground, and the rock fell with a loud thud, missing me by inches. "You need to stop this, Mark," she screamed. The tension in the air was thick. I raised my head and looked toward the road. Drivers had stopped, watching, some recording the scene with their phones. It was enough to make Mark panic. Without a word, he turned and ran. The woman stood up, slowly raising her hands, surrendering. I don't know what happened after that. The pain overtook me and I blacked out. When I woke up again, I was in a hospital room. Everything felt numb, but I was alive. Jane was sitting next to me, tears in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she whispered when she saw that I was awake. I nodded weakly, my heart aching for her. Jane didn't deserve any of this. She didn't deserve the betrayal or the horror, but when she told me that Mark was still missing, that the police were searching for him, my mind couldn't process it. The woman had already been arrested. Jane sniffled and pulled out a paper bag. "I brought you something." Maybe this will make you feel better. I reached out, and when I saw what she was holding, I couldn't help but smile. A single donut. I took it from her, biting into it hungrily. It was the best donut I'd ever tasted, but somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more in that bite, something I would never forget. Because that donut wasn't just a symbol of comfort. It was a reminder that in the end, sometimes what you think is sweet can be bitter beyond belief. Dunkin' Donuts has become my little ritual. Every morning, a small indulgence in a world full of chaos. It's not just the coffee, though. It's the familiarity, the routine, the workers knowing my order before I even say a word. Sure, there are times they get it wrong. But hey, mistakes happen, especially when you're a regular, pulling into that drive-thru as often as I do. It was just another typical morning when I pulled into the long line at Dunkin'. But this time, something was off. The line was longer than usual. Cars stretched around the building, snaking out into the parking lot, barely leaving enough room for me to pull my little sedan up to the ordering window. I knew I was pushing it. I was already running late for work, and this delay would make me even later. I quickly texted my manager, telling her I'd be a few minutes late, but would make it up to the team with donuts. She agreed, but her message was clear. Don't be too late. There's a 9:30 meeting. As I settled into the long wait, something strange happened. A black truck pulled up behind me. Not just any truck, this one had 6 wheels, not 4. It was massive, towering over my little sedan. I watched in my rearview mirror as the truck's driver laid on the horn, the sound echoing through the parking lot like an angry growl. I shrugged, unsure what else to do. There was nowhere to go. The line was stagnant, cars inching forward one by one. But he wasn't having it. The truck's driver revved his engine again and motioned for me to move forward. I tried to mouth a polite "I can't," but he wasn't having it. The honking continued, louder now, an assault on my ears. I turned around, my patience thinning, but there was no escaping this nightmare. The driver didn't back off. Instead, he just ramped up the noise as if daring me to move forward. What was he expecting from me? Was he going to ram me with his truck? Finally, the line moved just enough for the man to pull into a parking space. I thought that was the end of it, but no. The engine roared behind me, the revving relentless. Then came the shouting, loud, unintelligible curses. I flipped him off, my patience finally gone, and his response was immediate. He revved his engine in anger. I just wanted to get my coffee and get away from this maniac. But as I pulled away from the drive-thru, I glanced into my rearview mirror. His truck was still there, following me. My heart dropped. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself of the time. It wasn't my fault I was stuck in the drive-thru, and I certainly didn't deserve this. But the more I drove, the closer he stayed. Every time I stopped at a light, his truck would creep up beside me, his engine growling like some wild beast in the night. I texted my manager, telling her what was happening. She gave me a pass on the morning meeting, but I couldn't shake the fear. This wasn't just some guy angry about his coffee order anymore. It felt like something more, something darker. For a good 30 minutes I drove in circles, trying to lose him, but no matter which way I turned, he stayed right behind me. His headlights flashed, his engine roared, each rev louder than the last, as if trying to pull me into some nightmare I couldn't escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a turn, and I lost sight of him. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. The rest of my day passed uneventfully. I tried to ignore what had happened, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that the nightmare wasn't over. And then, around 2 a.m., it came again. The sound of an engine revving. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. I peered through the window. There, parked in front of my house, was the truck. It was him. The lights flashed on and off as he revved the engine, the growl of the engine vibrating through my walls. I didn't know what to do. I called the police. but they told me there was nothing they could do unless he did something more. They sent a unit, but when they arrived, the truck had already driven off. The next night, it was the same thing, and the night after that. For 5 nights, the truck was there, parked outside my house, revving its engine like some twisted ritual. I called the police again, but the man never did anything wrong. At least, nothing official. He just sat there haunting me every night, his engine growling in the darkness like a threat I couldn't escape. On the 5th night, I'd had enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I walked outside to confront him, heart pounding in my chest, the night air cold against my skin. I shouted, "What is your problem?" There was a pause. Then he killed the engine. The silence was deafening. The man slowly climbed out of his truck. He was massive, bald, wearing a thick leather jacket. In his hand, a baseball bat. "You're everything I hate about women," he sneered, stalking toward me. His words cut through the night like a knife. The rage in his eyes was palpable. I didn't wait to see what else he might do. I turned and ran for my front door, but he was fast. He reached me before I could even touch the handle, yanking me back by my hair and dragging me into my house. I could feel the cold sweat pouring down my back as I reached for anything to defend myself, grabbing the nearest knife. But it wasn't enough. He was closing in. Just then, I heard the sound of sirens, a rush of red and blue flashing lights. The man turned, surprised. In that moment, I saw my chance. The police burst through the door, guns drawn, and demanded he let me go. He hesitated, then dropped the bat. They cuffed him quickly, and with one last look, he was gone, taken away. The police told me I was lucky. Road rage had never escalated like this before, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never forget the sound of that engine. And I pray for the next person who flips him off that they never encounter what I did. Thanksgiving morning began like any other, a chill in the air, the faint aroma of Olivia's pumpkin pie wafting through our cozy little house. But as the frost melted off the rooftops, flashing red and blue lights bathed the neighborhood in a surreal glow. I should have stayed inside. I should have ignored it like I always do. But something about that day felt wrong. And by the end of the week, I would wish I had never stepped outside. It all began with a smell. Not your usual garbage on a hot day kind of stink, but something worse. Sweet and putrid, like rotting fruit mixed with raw meat. It clung to the back of your throat, making you gag every time you tried to breathe. Olivia, my wife, was the first to notice. "Maybe raccoons got into the bins again," she muttered, pulling the curtains aside to peer at the commotion 2 doors down. The house belonged to Mr. Elliot, quiet, wiry, and forgettable. Strange guy, Olivia had always said, though no one really knew much about him. He lived alone ever since his wife vanished years ago. Rumors swirled, as they do in small neighborhoods, but no one dared to ask questions. That evening, the police were still at his house, flashlights darting across the yard like fireflies. Olivia peeked from behind the blinds, her face pale as a sheet. Then the coroner's van pulled up. "He's dead," she whispered. By the time the turkey was in the oven, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Speculation spread like wildfire. "It wasn't just a death," Olivia hissed, holding her phone like a lifeline. "It was a murder." The details trickled in. Mr. Elliot's body had been found in his recliner, his throat slashed ear to ear. Above him, smeared in what looked like blood, was a jagged spiral symbol carved into the wall. I tried to shrug it off. Sure, it was unsettling, but it was over, right? Except, I couldn't stop thinking about 2 weeks earlier. I'd taken the trash out late one night and noticed his porch light flickering, not random, but in a deliberate rhythm. On, off, pause. It was almost like Morse code. I'd laughed about it at the time, but now the memory made my skin crawl. The next morning, Detective Hart arrived. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and no-nonsense, the kind of person who looked like she didn't believe in small talk. The way her gaze lingered on the empty lots at the edge of the cul-de-sac sent a shiver down my spine. Days turned into a blur of police activity and whispered conversations. Detective Hart wasn't just investigating a murder, she was unraveling something far more sinister. Word got out that Mr. Elliot had a history, a violent one, assault charges in his 20s, a stint in a psychiatric hospital, and whispers of involvement in a secretive underground cult. And then there was the journal. Pages upon pages of paranoid scribbles, warnings, and strange symbols. In the middle of it all was the same spiral that had been smeared on his wall. According to Hart, Elliot had fled the cult years ago, but they hadn't forgotten him. By Thanksgiving night, the festive cheer had been replaced with fear. Families locked their doors, the streets were eerily quiet, and even Olivia stayed off her group chats. But something was brewing. I felt it in the air, like the weight of an approaching storm. It was past midnight when I saw the van. White, nondescript, and crawling down the street like a predator stalking prey. It paused in front of Elliot's house and 3 men stepped out. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by caps and scarves. Without hesitation, they slipped into Elliot's backyard. Olivia grabbed my arm as I reached for my coat. "Don't you dare." "I'll just look," I whispered, though my heart was already hammering. I crept around the side of the house, staying low. Through the kitchen window, I saw them. The men were gathered in the living room, standing in a circle. One of them knelt in the center, arranging something on the floor, a photograph maybe. They spoke in low, guttural tones, the language unfamiliar and sharp. Then they lit it on fire. The flames roared to life, unnaturally bright, casting shadows that twisted and writhed. Those shadows weren't normal. They moved with intent, forming jagged spirals and grotesque shapes that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, my foot snapping a branch underfoot. The nearest man whipped his head toward the sound, his eyes locking onto mine. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the house. Olivia yanked the door open, her face white with terror as I scrambled inside. We locked every door and window, clutching kitchen knives as we huddled in the dark. Hours passed, each second stretching into an eternity, but the van never returned. By morning, the men were gone. The police found no evidence of a break-in. Detective Hart vanished soon after, transferred or resigned, no one seemed to know. And Mr. Elliot's murder, it remains unsolved. Sometimes late at night I think about the journal, the spirals on the walls, the way those men moved, their ritual casting impossible shadows. And I wonder if they'll come back, or if they ever really left. The smell of burnt turkey always takes me back to that night. Not the feast, not the family drama, but the shadows that moved when they shouldn't have. For years, Thanksgiving had been less of a celebration and more of a ritual of survival. Not because of the food or the guests, but because of him. James was the storm that never calmed, a volatile force lurking in every room of the house. This year, though, I thought I'd found my way out. A chance to break free from 10 years of fear, bruises, and the suffocating weight of his anger. I thought I'd planned for everything, but nothing could have prepared me for the darkness waiting on the other side of the door. The day started as they always did with James, barking orders from his throne on the couch. The flickering light of the football game reflected off the beer cans scattered around him. "Gravy better not be lumpy this year," he grumbled, not even looking up. "And don't overcook the turkey like you always do." "Yes, James," I muttered, keeping my tone flat. Inside, I counted down the hours. One more day, I told myself. One more day of biting my tongue, enduring his barbed words and threats. By tonight, I'd be gone. In the garage, hidden behind old paint cans, was my suitcase. Inside it were my clothes, the small stash of cash I'd managed to hide, and a prepaid burner phone with just enough minutes to call for help once I was far enough away. I had memorized every step, when he'd pass out drunk, when the house would be quiet, and how I'd slip into the night unnoticed. I'd planned for everything, except for the knock at the door. It was late afternoon when it happened. The soft rapping echoed through the house, out of place against the background noise of the football game. My heart skipped, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. Visitors were rare, especially uninvited ones. James grunted, annoyed. "Who the hell is that?" I peeked through the curtain and saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a heavy coat that seemed unnecessary for the mild weather. His face was unreadable, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his baseball cap. "Can I help you?" I asked hesitantly when I opened the door. "Car broke down," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Phone's dead. Mind if I use yours?" Something about him felt wrong. His tone, his posture, everything about him made my stomach churn. Before I could respond, James stomped to the door. "Who is it?" he barked. I stepped aside. "He says his car broke down." James looked the man up and down, suspicion etched into his face. "Where's your car?" The man hesitated, just for a moment. "A couple streets over," he said finally. "Didn't think anyone was home at the other houses." James didn't buy it. Crossing his arms, he sneered. "Yeah, well, we don't have a phone. You're out of luck." The man's eyes flicked to me for the briefest moment before he nodded and walked away. I watched him disappear down the street, unease curling in my gut. "Creeps like that. You don't let them in," James growled, grabbing another beer, probably casing the place, looking for an easy mark. By the time dinner rolled around, the tension in the house was suffocating. I focused on the simple tasks, carving the turkey, setting the table, all while fighting the growing sense of dread that something wasn't right. And then, as I laid the last dish on the table, I saw it. Movement. A shadow flickered just outside the window. "James," I whispered, my voice trembling. "There's someone outside." He slammed his beer down and stalked to the window, yanking the curtain aside. "I don't see anything," he snapped. "I swear I saw—" "Enough!" His voice boomed through the room, making me flinch. "You're just looking for excuses to ruin dinner. Sit down." I obeyed, my hands trembling as I picked up my fork. We were halfway through the meal when the living room window shattered. The sound was deafening, a sharp, explosive crash that made me scream. James shot to his feet, knocking his chair over in the process. "What the hell?" he shouted, but before either of us could react, they were inside. 3 men in ski masks, their dark clothing blending with the shadows. One of them pointed a gun at James. "Sit down," the man ordered, his voice cold and commanding. James hesitated for a moment before raising his hands and slowly lowering himself back into his chair. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "Take whatever you want," James stammered, his bravado crumbling. "We don't have much, but it's yours." The man with the gun chuckled darkly. "We're not here for your money." The leader of the group, a tall man with a menacing presence, dragged a chair from the corner of the room and sat down across from James. "We know who you are," he said, his voice calm but dripping with malice. James stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man leaned forward, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Sure you do. You think you can screw people over and walk away, think no one's going to come knocking?" I glanced at James, confused and terrified. He avoided my eyes, his jaw tight. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice trembling. "Payback," the man said simply. As they argued, I saw my chance. One of the men had his back to me, distracted. Slowly, I reached for the carving knife on the table, my fingers wrapping around the handle. The leader must have noticed. His dark eyes flicked to me, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "What about her?" he asked, tilting his head toward me. Does she know what kind of man she's married to? James's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I thought he'd turn on me instead of them. She doesn't know anything, he spat. The man laughed softly. That's what I thought. I didn't wait to hear what he would say next. With every ounce of strength I had, I lunged, driving the knife into the side of the nearest man. The room erupted into chaos. James tackled the leader, and I scrambled to grab the gun the injured man had dropped. Another man lunged at me, but I fired a shot before he could reach me. The sound was deafening, the recoil sending a shock through my arms. The fight was a blur of screams, blood, and desperate movements. When it was over, 2 of the intruders lay motionless on the floor. The third had fled, leaving a trail of blood behind him. James slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder where a knife had grazed him. You saved me," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. I stared at him, the gun still trembling in my hands. "No," I said quietly. "I saved myself. I didn't wait for him to recover." While he was still dazed, I grabbed my suitcase, my keys, and the burner phone. "Where are you going?" he called after me, his voice weak, but I didn't answer. I drove through the night, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me. For the first time in a decade, I felt free. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the shadows of that night are still following me, and I wonder if they ever really left. Thanksgiving is supposed to be a time for gratitude and family. But for some families, it's not about giving thanks. It's about surviving the gathering. For us, Thanksgiving wasn't a celebration. It was a battlefield. This one, though, was destined to be different. It was Grandma's last. Cancer had taken its toll, leaving her frail and barely clinging to her voice. She had one final wish, to see her family together under one roof. And no matter the tension that simmered between us, we all owed her that. The moment Uncle Dennis walked through the door, I knew this wasn't going to be the heartfelt goodbye she dreamed of. What none of us realized was how far things would spiral, how the darkness in one person's heart could pull the rest of us into the abyss. The house felt strange from the moment we arrived. Maybe it was the way the curtains were drawn tight against the daylight, leaving the living room cloaked in shadows. Or maybe it was the heavy silence that hung in the air, pressing on our chests like a weight. Dad parked the car, but none of us moved to get out. Mom stared at the house, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "He's here, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Dad sighed. "Mom wanted him here, Helen. What were we supposed to do, say no to a dying woman?" Mom didn't reply. Instead, she opened the car door, her movements stiff, like she was bracing herself for a storm. Inside, the house buzzed with low, uneasy energy. Aunt Linda was in the kitchen, muttering under her breath as she stabbed at the green bean casserole. Cousin Sarah sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a blank expression. No one was really talking, just stealing glances at the dining room, where Dennis sat at the far end of the table. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked thinner now, meaner. His face was lined with bitterness, and his eyes scanned the room like a predator sizing up prey. The last time Dennis had been here, the fight was so bad Grandma told him never to come back. Even as a kid, I remembered the yelling, the fear in everyone's eyes. Now he was back, and he didn't look like a man seeking forgiveness. When dinner started, the tension at the table was suffocating. Grandma sat at the head, her oxygen tank hissing softly as she tried to speak above the silence. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice barely audible. "It means the world to me." We murmured polite replies, but the air felt heavy, like we were all holding our breath. Dennis sat quietly for most of the meal, cutting his turkey with slow, deliberate movements. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "who wants to start?" The room froze. "Start what?" Dad asked, his voice wary. Dennis smirked. The confessions. Isn't that what family dinners are for? Clearing the air? No one said a word. Grandma looked down at her plate, her hands trembling. Dennis turned his attention to Aunt Linda first. How about you, Linda? Still sneaking off to see your high school boyfriend? Or did Frank finally figure it out? Linda's face turned ashen. Shut up, Dennis, she hissed. Oh, come on, Dennis said, laughing. We're all family here. No secrets, right? Stop it, Grandma said weakly, her voice trembling. But Dennis wasn't done. He turned to Sarah next. And you, Sarah, how's the baby? Oh, wait, that's right. You didn't keep it, did you? Sarah's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, tears streaming down her face. You're a monster, she whispered before running out of the room. Dennis chuckled darkly. See, this is what happens when you bury things. They rot. Enough. Dad slammed his fist on the table, his voice booming. Dennis didn't flinch. He turned to Dad, his smirk widening. Oh, Jim, you're the last person who should be taking the moral high ground. Want to tell Helen about the little indiscretion with your secretary, or should I? The room erupted. Dad lunged across the table, knocking over a wine glass as he grabbed Dennis by the collar. Mom was shouting. Linda was crying. And in the chaos, no one noticed Grandma struggling to breathe. Her wheezing silenced the room. We rushed to her side, adjusting her oxygen mask as she clutched the edges of her wheelchair. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Stop this. For a moment, everyone froze. Even Dennis seemed to feel a flicker of shame. But then Grandma said something that changed everything. It's my fault, she said, her voice breaking. We all stared at her. What are you talking about, Mom? Dad asked gently. Grandma's hands trembled as she gripped the wheelchair tighter. I let him come back, she said, her eyes filling with tears. After what he did, I thought he'd changed. Dennis's smirk vanished, his face twisted with anger. Don't, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. But Grandma kept going. Your cousin Alex, she said, her voice breaking. The night he disappeared. It was Dennis. The room went cold. What are you talking about? Dad's voice shook. Grandma closed her eyes. He hurt Alex. I didn't know at first, but when I found out, I couldn't let him go to jail. He was my son. You're lying, Dennis shouted, standing so fast his chair toppled over. No, Grandma said, her voice steady now. I'm not. Dennis lunged at her, but Dad intercepted him, slamming him against the wall. Plates shattered, chairs fell, and the house erupted into chaos. Call the police, Mom shouted, her voice breaking. Dennis fought like a wild animal, but Dad held him down. You killed him, didn't you? Dad roared, his voice filled with rage. Dennis didn't answer. Instead, he laughed. A cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. The police arrived soon after, dragging Dennis out of the house as he screamed that we were all liars, that we'd never prove anything. Grandma passed away 3 days later. The family never recovered. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that Thanksgiving, about the way Dennis's laugh echoed through the house, about the secrets that had festered for years, finally brought to light. They say family is forever, but some scars run too deep to heal. Some things can never be forgiven.